Hello, I'm Ann Medina, and welcome to the Leaders' Debate, coming to you from the National Arts Centre here in Ottawa. There are two dramatic differences between tonight's debate and others that have taken place in the past. First, there are 5 party leaders participating. They are Jean Chrétien, leader of the Liberal Party, Kim Campbell of the Progressive Conservatives, Preston Manning, leader of the Reform Party, Lucien Bouchard of the Bloc Québécois, and Audrey McLaughlin, leader of the New Democratic Party. Also unique, tonight we have an audience chosen from all regions of the country, an audience that will be asking questions. Tonight's format has 2 basic elements. The first follows the more traditional pattern. Each leader will give a brief opening statement, and then through their questions, a panel of journalists will introduce 5 separate topics for debate. After that, for the first time in a national debate, we will take questions from our audience before each leader gives his or her closing remarks. This format and the rules for tonight, from the length of the opening statements to the appropriateness of follow-up questions, they have all been agreed to by the 5 parties. Whenever the leaders are given a time limit, I hope that they honor it. I hate interrupting people, so I will let the speakers finish their brief sentences if the time runs out mid-phrase. And finally, in every case where there is an order of appearance, a draw has been held. So that gives you a sense of what's coming up tonight. Now let's begin. The first leader to give an opening statement will be Preston Manning, the leader of the Reform Party. Mr. Manning.
Well, thank you, Ann, and thanks to you for joining us for this leaders' debate tonight. These debates are the first time that the leaders of the traditional parties have been confronted on a national stage by political newcomers. And the reason for that is that many Canadians are not happy with what the old parties are offering and are willing to look for fresh alternatives. The need for this was illustrated last night, in the debate last night, when, in my judgment, the leaders spent too long and too much time attacking each other and not enough time attacking the problems that are of concern to you. The high unemployment rates, the deteriorating social services, excessive spending, excessive taxation. When the leaders did get onto the issues, they spent too much time on the symptoms and not enough on the root causes of those problems and those solutions. What Reform wants to do tonight is to attack the real problems of concern to you and to get to root causes with common sense solutions. So you be the judge tonight. Who gets off on symptoms and who gets to root causes? Who best attacks the problems of most concern to you? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Manning. Audrey McLaughlin, the leader of the New Democratic Party.
Good evening. In last night's debate, we saw the other leaders arguing amongst themselves about the Constitution. Do you want 4 more years of constitutional bickering, or do you want Ottawa to deal with the issues that are of really concern to you and your family? Canadians are telling me that they're worried about whether their future will include the security of social programs like health care. They're right to worry. Ms. Campbell's government has already cut health care by $8 million a day and has a hidden agenda to cut even more. Mr. Manning wants private health care and private hospitals, one level of care for the rich and another for the rest of us. Mr. Chrétien claims he'll defend Medicare, but the Liberals also promised to fight free trade, and they gave up that fight. Can you afford to have them give up on Medicare? Ottawa should go after the rich who've been getting a free ride and leave your Medicare alone. While you worry about your sons and daughters' future, will they have a decent job? The sons and daughters of Canadian millionaires see their future protected through tax-free trusts. You pay taxes, but not them. That's wrong. And together, we can change that. We need men and women who will fight for Medicare and defend fair taxes. Tonight, I ask you to consider this. Canadians risk losing Medicare if we do not defend it in this election. The next election will be too late.
Thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. Kim Campbell, the leader of the Progressive Conservatives.
Good evening. In the 100 days since I became Prime Minister of Canada, I've been listening to Canadians all across the country. I don't see their problems as mere statistics. I see the faces and hear the voices of real people who deserve real solutions to their problems. As a woman, a Westerner, and first political leader of my generation, I share their frustration and the urgent need not just to talk, but to act. Government doesn't have all the answers, but it has a responsibility to act on three fundamental issues: the creation of real, lasting jobs, ending deficits and spiraling taxes, and protecting our social safety net. Higher deficits mean higher taxes. Higher taxes kill jobs, and higher deficits erode our social safety net. Tonight I won't be attacking the people on this stage with me, but I will be telling you about their policies and why I think they fail to reflect the real concerns of Canadians. Mr. Manning has a plan to eliminate the deficit in 3 years, but it won't work, and he has no plan to create jobs. Mr. Chrétien has a plan to create jobs, but it won't work, and he has no plan to eliminate the deficit. I have a plan to create jobs and to eliminate the deficit without raising taxes. I have a plan to preserve our social programs. Tonight, I look forward to talking to you about that plan.
Thank you, Ms. Campbell. Lucien Bouchard, the Bloc Québécois.
Thank you. Good evening. As we all know, Canada is going through an economic crisis. 3.5 years after the beginning of the recession, GNP per capita is still 5% below the 1989 level. The federal debt has become an albatross. Unemployment remains stubbornly high. In short, the Canadian economy is in decline. But Canada is also going through a political crisis. The failure of Meach and the Charlottetown referendum have led to rest all hope of renewing the federal system. The status quo is costly and offers no solution for the future because of the constant overlapping of federal and provincial responsibilities and the systematic inconsistencies it breeds. To solve the economic crisis, we must solve the political crisis. No consistent economic strategy can be devised that fits the needs and aspirations of both Quebec and Canada. There are two countries in this land. The Bloc Québécois is a product of the times and of the will of Quebecers to control their own destiny. It's a new political instrument which seeks to bring about a quiet resolution of the current impasse. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bouchard. Finally, Jean Chrétien, the leader of the Liberal Party.
Good evening. For me, this election is about jobs and economic growth, about protecting Medicare, about returning honesty and integrity to public life, and about maintaining political stability in a united Canada. It's completely unacceptable that in a country like Canada, 1.6 million people are unemployed. 46% of those who have jobs are afraid of losing them. For the first time in our history, parents believe that the future of their children will be less promising than their own. It's time for change. That's why I've assembled a new team of outstanding women and men in every province. They are committed to servicing the people, not themselves. And it's why we have developed a realistic plan for jobs and economic growth for today, not only for the year 2000. Above all, this election is about people and about which party has the best team and the best plan to put Canada back to work. It's about restoring dignity and hope for a better future. You deserve nothing less.
Thank you, Mr. Chrétien. And now we'll turn to the debates. As I mentioned, 5 themes will be introduced through questions by our panel of journalists, and they are Peter Kent from Global Television, Leslie Jones from CTV, and Joe Schlesinger from CBC. In this section, each leader will give a brief answer to the first question before the debate begins. It is their choice as to how they wish to respond, so you will not be hearing any reporter or myself point out that a question has not been answered. A few points to keep in mind. For those of you who are poised with your stopwatches ready to count up the seconds that each party is on, you can put them down. All the parties have agreed that these debating sections would be better served if we removed the straitjacket of equal time. Instead, each party leader has been assured of the opportunity to state his or her position. The first theme to be debated is jobs, and I'll let Leslie Jones ask the first question of Jean Chrétien.
Last night in the French debate, you were all asked why voters should believe any of your promises to put Canadians back to work. We polled members of the audience afterwards, and they said, none of you answered the question. So we're going to give you the opportunity to do it again. In 1984, Brian Mulroney campaigned on jobs, jobs, jobs. 9 years later, we have 1.6 million people unemployed. But at the end of the Liberal government, we had 1.5 million Canadians unemployed. So please tell Canadians why they should trust any of your promises now.
Because we have worked very hard to develop the plan that we have made public. We have put it in writing. We have a program of creation of jobs in infrastructure, in housing. We have a youth corps that we want to create. We talk about apprenticeship. We talk about small and medium-sized businesses that need some help. And 85% of the jobs are created by the small and medium-sized businesses. We have to help them in financing and export and whatnot. And it is the priority of the people of Canada today. They want us to create jobs. And it is, last week, the IMF and the Group of Seven, they said that the Western industrialized nation should give at this moment priority to job creation and economic growth. And it's why we have put it in writing. It's all well documented. The CASA's there. And we have told the Canadian people where we will cut to get the money to create these jobs and create growth.
Audrey McLaughlin?
Yes, we need a coherent long-term jobs plan in this country. And we must have an equilibrium between addressing the deficit and addressing job creation. And there's no way that you can address the debt and the deficit without increasing employment in this country. We've got to stop the myth that unemployment is free. Unemployment costs this country $30 billion a year. So we have a jobs plan. Short-term, infrastructure program, a national child care program. Medium-term, an investment fund to stimulate small business, not handouts, but grants. Long-term research and development. If we're going to develop the jobs of the future, we have to invest in education and research and development. We have to scrap the Tory trade deals. They cost Canadians 250 jobs a day since 1988. And so we have to have a comprehensive plan that also includes a fair tax system. I'm very proud and confident that our plan will achieve the objectives that we have set out.
Lucien Bouchard.
Thank you. Job creation is one of the Bloc's top priorities, but talk is cheap. If we want to really achieve job creation, the government needs to invest, but where can we find the money? We believe that we need a balanced approach, that it's possible to do that without touching the social programs and transfer payments. The way to achieve the solution is to cut the military budget, to suppress a lot of tax shelters and government fat. Money saved here must be reinvested partly in job creation, partly to reduce the deficit. And apart from public infrastructures, it's a good thing to replace sidewalks, but it's not enough. We have to stimulate private investments. We don't do that enough. And one of the measures we propose is a 20% investment tax credit, as well as the creation of an industrial launching fund to stimulate industry.
Preston Manning.
Well, your specific question was why should you trust what anyone says on this? And I think people should trust what's being said if it looks like the answer gets to the root of the problem, not the symptoms. Now, the jobs in the future are going to be created mainly by the private sector. The big governments are all de-hiring. If you go to private sector investors, big ones, small ones, domestic ones, foreign ones, and ask them, why aren't you investing more in private sector job creation in this country? They give you this short answer. They say the spending levels of government are too high, the deficit and debt is too high, and the tax levels that go along with that are too high. Now, that's why we say the way to get to genuine private sector job creation is to get the deficit and the debt down. And we've got a specific program for doing that, reducing the federal deficit to zero in 3 years. We believe deficit reduction, if it's done right, is stimulative to private sector job creation.
Kim Campbell.
Well, I would agree with Mr. Manning's analysis of the impact of the debt and the deficit on job creation. But I think you have to have a constructive plan. I think Canadians understand that the government cannot itself create jobs as such, that that's a very expensive and ineffective way to create long-term economic prosperity. And they're realists, and they will trust a party and a government that give them honest answers to this question. We have a 4-point plan. First of all, that involves investing in small businesses and new businesses to help them grow. One of the greatest barriers to small business creation and business growth is lack of access to capital. A small change that we made in the Small Business Loans Act has just created 83,000 new jobs over a fiscal year. That's an immediate, short-term job creation. We need to help our businesses export more. 30% of our income comes from exports. Every $1 billion of exports creates 15,000 new jobs. Investing in science, technology, and research and development, very significant, and also education and training. One of the most significant barriers between Canadians and employment today is lack of the proper skills. That's our 4-point plan that is both realistic and effective.
Leslie Jones, you have a follow-up question for Mr. Chrétien.
Mr. Chrétien, you referred to your infrastructure program, which you say will create thousands and thousands of jobs, and that will in turn spur economic growth to create more jobs. But many economists are saying no amount of government spending will kickstart our weak economy. So that means there will still be 1 million Canadians unemployed. How do you intend to put them back to work, and when?
You know, we cannot claim that this program will cure all the problems. I mentioned that 85% of the jobs are created by small and medium-sized business. But when the people are unemployed, it is the time to build up the infrastructure of the nation because costs are low. And it's not only a program that makes some sense at this moment, it is being demanded by all the municipalities of Canada. And 2 weeks ago in Baddeck, Nova Scotia, the Premier asked for a program of job creation of this nature. It's exactly what they're doing at this moment in Japan, they're doing that in the United States, they're doing that in Germany. They're investing in the infrastructure. And it's much better when you get out and you go in a street and you see for sale, bankrupts, unemployment, you don't spend your money. But when you see some economic activities, when you see some building erected, some truck moving, you feel good and you spend your money. And it's why we want to do that. And we said that since some times. And why the IMF and the Group of 7, 10 days ago, said to the industrial world, stop what Mr. Manning is talking about, just inflation and deficit cutting. They say it's the time to invest. That is the policy of 1990 that was recommended. But for 1992, they say we have to put the people back to work because we're developing an underclass in the Canadian society and the industrial world. And it is the time when we have spare money and people available is to put them to work to create the wealth that will be shared by all the people of Canada.
But John, you say that you want to put people back to work, but what in fact your jobs plan does is keep in place the trade deals, the Canada-US trade deal, and proceeding with NAFTA, which we know since 1988 has helped to put 250 Canadians out of work a day. How can you say you have a jobs plan that will create work on the one hand and refuse when you had the chance in the House of Commons, I might add, to defeat NAFTA? Your party stayed home. You didn't defeat NAFTA. You had a chance to do it, and then you stood with your big company friends and not with the unemployed worker in Windsor.
We always voted against this deal, but you're completely unrealistic, Madame McLaughlin, when you want to build a wall around Canada.
Nobody wants to build a wall around Canada. We are the biggest trading nation in the world. What they want to get rid of is bad trade
per capita, we are the biggest trading nation in the world. So we want to renegotiate that.
It's really wonderful. This is a repeat of all the wonderful discussions we get in the House of Commons, where the NDP and the Liberals try to outdo themselves in their support of trade. And yes, we want to have trade, and yes, we want to trade with underdeveloped countries, but every time we have an agreement that will in fact secure Canadian access to markets, they're against it. They want trade, but not with anybody in particular, because after all, that might require us to have some reciprocity. The big problem, let me finish, the big problem with Mr. Chrétien's job plan is that it would add $600 in taxes to every Canadian household. Yes, it's stimulative.
How can you say that?
It's stimulative. It's easy arithmetic. It's stimulative. It's $6 billion in taxes. None of the government has any money to do this.
No, we're canceling your helicopter to get the money. Those helicopters that nobody wants will take the money there.
Well, you've spent that money so many times, and I hope you're not going to send people up in 40-year-old helicopters. I hope you're going to spend the $2.5 billion that's necessary to refit those helicopters after you cancel the program.
Mr. Manning, you had a point. Mr. Chrétien, let me ask
a constructive question. What was the unemployment rate in the year when they threw the Liberals out of office? It was 11%. The poll is almost the same as it was now. By pursuing the policy that you're talking about, you drove the deficit up to $38 billion, the debt up to $200 billion, and it didn't create jobs. The unemployment rate in the last year of your administration is the same as it's going to be in the last year of Kim's, 11%. It didn't work.
Yes, but it was. We were getting out of a recession, and it is that when we're in a recession is the time.
Yeah, but we're supposed to be getting out of one now.
We spend money to kickstart the economy at this time.
No, but John.
And at that time, Mr. Mulroney was the new fresh face, said to the Canadians, I will reduce the deficit.
Okay, let's talk
in 9 years, he had
kickstart.
$32 billion on average of deficit every year.
But let's talk about kickstarting. This is a $700 billion GDP economy. Like, if you believe you can kickstart that with a $2 billion investment in sewers, you believe that you could start a 747 with a flashlight battery. The relationship is out of whack.
But you do nothing.
No, we
You
don't.
do nothing when the people are starving out there and they want the dignity to go to work. You stay home, we'll pay the debt.
Nobody's saying stay home. There is an important role for government to play. And the important role for government to play is to look at what the barriers are to economic growth. What are the barriers to employment? I'm traveling across the country and talking to Canadians, and a lot of the questions I get are for young people coming out of university who are saying, where am I going to get a job? They want jobs that are going to use their skills. It is important to have infrastructure, but when the economy is booming, that money is there because offices are filled with people who are doing business, paying taxes, paying rates, and municipalities can afford their jobs. What you're doing is the old trick of the government picking and choosing which sectors of the economy are going to be stimulated instead of allowing those sectors of the economy that are ready to grow because you take away the barriers to their growth. That's what we should be doing when we're investing the very scarce resources of Canadians, is liberating that creative potential that's there. And I'll tell you, it is there. I've traveled this country, and it's there. I am very hopeful about this country.
Campbell, the
And
Tory
it's you,
jobs
Madam Campbell,
plan.
who said to the young people of Canada, don't call us. We'll call you in year 2000.
I never said that, and
you
you know
said
that.
And,
Well,
Mr. Bouchard, you had a question.
Like Canada.
Well, I can see why you play fast and loose with the truth.
Personally-
The
Mr. Bouchard
fact
had
is
a
there are real
point.
things to do.
Personally, I can't help finding Mr. Chrétien's plan somewhat simplistic. To count on the sight of trucks moving around a city to trigger the renewal of the economy is rather confusing. The same thing when he says that we should get rid of the trade deal with the United States. I don't think how it could be achieved. The trade deal has its deficiencies. We have had some in Quebec, of course. We are complaining about the lack of retraining programs. But on the whole, in Quebec, we accept it because we are free traders. We are quite ready to take on the international challenges of competition. And as we know, we're very instrumental in adopting the trade deal. But when you say that you can renegotiate the trade deal with the States, this is very, very dangerous. We have made victories there. We have a mechanism to settle disputes that nobody has. And if you try to open up the treaty, you can lose everything.
But,
Well,
they are
Mr.
in the
Bouchard.
treaty, the FTA agreement, clause 1906. It is written there that in the 7 years following the introduction of the free trade agreement, the Americans are obligated by treaty to sit down with the Canadian government to make a clear definition of what is dumping and what is a subsidy. There is an obligation by the Americans to sit down with us, and it's exactly what Mr. Rich has said yesterday. He said the obligation is there. The Tories tried to take it away in their negotiation with NAFTA, and we say no. Let's finish the FTA and let's have a clear definition
are you
of
saying-
You're
dumping.
not going to
I
finish
was
the
quite surprised
FTA.
by
We're not
Mr.
going to
Ritchie's-
cancel
You
the
will not-
FTA.
No, I say that I want to have a clear definition because what has been the problem over the last 5 years? It's they have imposed unilaterally duties on softwood lumber, on magnesium, on cars, on wheat, on all sort of products, because there is no definition. When we'll have a definition, they will respect the definition, we will respect the definition, and we will be able to beat them. But we need the
Are you
definition.
We already have
proposing to
one.
renegotiate
You don't
the
like
trade agreement?
the Canada-U.S. trade deal.
Let's just one at a time. Are you proposing to renegotiate the Canada-U.S. trade agreement?
Mr. Manning, under clause
It seems a
1906.
simple question.
Simple question.
Let me
Are
finish.
you proposing?
Yeah. It's not a renegotiation, Mr. Manning. The Americans have agreed in the treaty to sit down with Canada to give us a definition and to
But you're not going to renegotiate, attempt to renegotiate the entire treaty.
I say that I have 5 conditions that I want to renegotiate or negotiate. 2 have been already reopened. Madam Campbell and Mr. Maroney said we could not reopen at all, and they have reopened at the demand of President Clinton the question on labor and the question on the environment. I say I want to have a clear definition of what is dumping and what is subsidy. They are obligated to sit down with us 2 more years.
You're backing
off this concept, and you're backing off this concept of renegotiating.
No, we have not, Mr. Manning, negotiated as yet the definition, and they are obligated to do that in the first 7 years after the implementation.
Mr. McLaughlin, you wanted to get in a point? If we could let
Chrétien, if you feel that the Canada-U.S. trade deal is not sufficient, I agree with you. I think we should abrogate it. It's not renegotiable. John Turner said just the other day it wasn't renegotiable. But why wouldn't you then have your members show up in the House of Commons when we could have defeated NAFTA in the House of Commons? It's hypocritical to say that you don't like the Canada-U.S. trade deal. You want to renegotiate, but you allow NAFTA to go through when you had the opportunity, Mr. Chrétien.
We didn't have the opportunity to defeat it because the Tories had more voters than us.
No, they did not, Mr. Chrétien.
They had the majority. We were not having the majority.
You did not. You are wrong.
We were there, and we voted against every proposition on that because we were not satisfied.
Liberals missing. The vote passed by 19.
Mr. Manning?
Where, Mr. Chrétien, were the rest of the Liberals so they could stand with New Democrats and say no to NAFTA?
We voted against it in every stage, and other stage, your people were not there either.
Mr. Manning, you had a point?
Okay, yeah, Audrey, if we can come back to the main point here, which is jobs, and I think we all agree that trade relations have something to do with jobs. Good trade relations will stimulate jobs. But I frankly can't understand this business of why you would want to abrogate the current treaty. The current American Congress is more protectionist than the one that we had in 1980. There's more anti-import speeches being made down there. They also consider the Canadian economy to be weaker because of our low performance, and they think we've got a constitutional problem. So if you renegotiate that agreement under those conditions, your opponent is more anti-import, and they think you're weaker. Even put it in labor management terms, it's like the management is more anti-union, and they think the union is weaker. You would get a new agreement, all right, but it would be worse than the one you have now. That would hurt employment in Canada and jobs. It would not help.
I appreciate your lecture, but, the Canada-U.S. trade deal has cost us over 400,000 jobs. That's a very high price to pay.
So let's do the things to make it work. Let's do the things to make it work.
The textile worker who's unemployed, the auto worker who's unemployed. It has not given us easier access to the American market.
Audrey, do the things
Why
to make
do you
it work?
insist that we must accept bad trade deals? The United States not trading with us
Audrey,
because they're Mother Teresa and they're doing us a favor.
There's a solution here, Audrey. There's a solution. Let's do the things you got to do to make it work. Like, let's get our tax levels competitive with our big competitors. Let's
have everybody make $4 a day.
Let's get labor force management adjustment mechanisms that will help train and retrain large numbers of workers, and let's get rid of our internal barriers to trade. But let's make the thing work rather than abrogate it.
And so with
that point, I'd like to know, and we could go on and on and on. But
and we will.
I know. I'd like now to turn to the second topic, which is social programs, and if Joe Schlesinger could ask a question of Audrey McLaughlin.
All of you have been telling us that you'll fix our fraying social programs. We've heard everything from transferring programs and dumping them into the laps of the provinces to keeping the programs as they are and even adding new ones. I think Canadians have 2 fears. One is that our cherished social programs will go broke. And the other fear is that they'll be reformed to death or into irrelevance. So what I really would like to ask all of you is, what do you have in mind? What sort of cuts do you have in mind? Whom are you going to reform, restructure, modernize? The sick and the health plans, the poor and their welfare, the unemployed and their UI. And if you aren't going to cut, as you say you won't, Ms. McLaughlin, where are you going to get the money? Higher taxes? Higher revenue from some fortuitous economic boom around the corner?
Well, first of all, let's again destroy the myth that unemployment is free. There's absolutely no cost to people being unemployed or living in poverty. It's a huge cost in human terms and financial cost to our society. You know, there was a recent study that said for every dollar that we invest in a child in need, we save $5.50 later on in policing costs and other social services. I mean, let's use our heads here. Do we want to simply say to those who are sick, oh, well, just get a private plan, it'll be all right? I talked to a gentleman from the States the other day. He's going to have to pay $1,000 a month. His wife has cancer. It won't cover it because she had cancer before he took on the plan. It is possible to get the money. It is a question of priorities. Do you want a health care program, social programs, or helicopters? Do you want to close tax loopholes for the rich, the $1 billion that we spend for the entertainment business tax? Do you want to tax private trusts? Everyone has to pay their share. Social programs, health programs make us a society that is attractive to business.
Preston Manning.
Well, Joe, I'd start by saying, again, get to the root of the problem. Let's say take one program, Medicare. Now, it's our assessment that health care is ill itself. It's got a financial illness, and many people there watching know that that's the case. Hospitals being closed, you have friends, relatives, perhaps yourself on waiting lists, that health care in this country has a serious illness. Now, we say rather than deny it or pretend that it isn't there, let's get at the solution. And what we're saying is that the object of the federal government should be to make sure health care is within the financial reach of every citizen, no matter where they live or what their income is. Let the people of each province direct their provincial government as to how they should raise the money to cover their part of health care. And the federal government's commitment should be to maintain these federal transfers in support of health care at the current levels or higher. And the big thing the federal government's been doing is having these declining transfer payments in support of health care, which is a big part of the problem. Now, that's at least a solution that gets at the root of the problem.
Lucien Bouchard.
Well, obviously, the protection that we give to people who have problems in Canada, people who need social help from the government, is a value of Canada and Quebec. We should stick to it. It's a great victory of our democracy. And I can't understand that all those platforms in many other parties are threatening the social programs. So we have to do something. To protect the social programs, we have to extract the money from where it is. The money is in the fat of the government, it is in the military budget, it is in the tax shelters. I can't understand why the Tory party is trying to threaten the social parties when they keep those scandalous, ludicrous tax shelters, for example, the family trust. This is not acceptable for Canadians and Quebecers.
Kim Campbell.
Well, I think the reason why Canadians are afraid about the future of social programs is they know that we have a serious deficit problem. And they're concerned that the first knee-jerk reaction in people looking to cut the deficit will be to attack social programs. And that's why I've set out very clearly how I would eliminate the deficit without doing that. I don't think it's necessary. I think our social programs, many of them need to be reformed to work better for Canadians. I mean, unemployment insurance is based on a model that was developed in the 1960s, when we gave UI during an economic downturn, when people would expect basically to go back to the same job. Our economy is going through a serious period of restructuring now. Very often people need new jobs. We need to do more with UI. We need to provide training. We're now providing about $3.8 billion a year in training. We need to do more. But I think I'm fundamentally committed to preserving our social programs, which is why I feel so passionately about dealing with our deficit problem, because it is in fact the ticking time bomb, which if not defused, will in fact kill our social programs. But we don't need to kill them if we act now to eliminate the deficit.
Jean Chrétien.
For me, Canadians have always believed in shared social responsibility. We've done it quite well in Canada over a long period of time through Medicare, Old Age Security Plan, Canada Pension Plan, and unemployment insurance. And I want to maintain that because it is, the dignity of everybody. But when we talk about Medicare, when you go on the path that you want to go, Mr. Manning, to start to use user fees, what will happen? Yes, you said that. You said that the rich will have access to better services if they can pay for that. So eventually, you have a system for the rich and a system for the poor. Here in Canada, we're going into
Mr. Manning, this is Mr. Chrétien's turn.
Yes, thank you, madam. When in Canada we go in an hospital, it's not because we are rich. It's because we are Canadian citizens and we are sick. And I don't want that system to change, and it's why I want to make sure that Medicare remain universal and free for every citizen in our land.
Joe Schlesinger, you have a follow-up question for Audrey McLaughlin?
You know, Ms. McLaughlin, the Medicare program started under the NDP in Saskatchewan, and the NDP has every right to be proud of it. Unfortunately, as you keep proposing the program that you do now, we have other NDP governments in power, and they have shown that perhaps the NDP model of all those things that you talk about, that the provinces that we're talking about, that they can't afford them. That in Saskatchewan we see hospitals closing down. We see in Ontario medicine for pensioners being cut back. We see all sorts of other things being cut back. And the question is, again, how are you going to pay for it? Are there that many rich in this country that you can tax? Is there a department of waste somewhere in the government that you can cut out? Where is this money going to come from? And it isn't. They don't have it in Ontario. They don't have it in Saskatchewan.
Well, I know that there are a number of things, of course, we could cut out. We could cut out the non-elected Senate that costs Canadians $150,000 a day. There are many things we could cut out. I'm the one that raised the question of MPs' pensions and how we should look at that. But the real issue here is what has happened over the number of years of the Conservative government is we've seen $34 billion worth of cutbacks to health care and post-secondary education in this country in transfers to provinces and territories. We no longer have a federal government that believes in a healthcare system that has any vision in it. We see a federal government, a Tory government, that puts in a drug patent law which will increase radically the cost of drugs for every healthcare plan for every province and territory. And on the one hand, Ms. Campbell will say, I support healthcare. I'll throw myself on the train tracks. Well, destroy the train, so that won't work. But, you know, to say that, which is the very common line, we can't afford it. We can't afford in this country to see, as I've seen, senior citizens watching their friends not getting health care and saying, as a woman did to me in Winnipeg, dear God, if this happens to me, kill me first. It is a question of priorities. Now, I want to say that in our jobs plan, which reduces the deficit, we talk about, for every dollar we spend, how we will raise that or reallocate spending. The provinces and territories are directly the victims. We have a federal government that talks about the deficit, but simply wants to transfer it to the provinces. Well, and I would say, Mr. Schlesinger, that finally, it is a question of priorities. And this is the decision that Canadians will make in this election. Is this a priority for us?
Yes, I think that we have to put this problem in perspective. In Canada, we spend 9% of GNP for medical care for all citizens. In the United States, with their private sector system that you love so much, Madam Campbell and
that's not correct, John.
They spend 14% of their GNP for their medical services. There are 30 million people who are not covered. So we don't want that system in Canada. In fact, the Americans are trying to copy our own system. But one of the big problems that we have had with Medicare and other transfer payments with the Tory administration is we signed 5 years agreement with the provinces. Before, when it was signed, the federal government always respected the signature.
Okay, John,
let me finish. Since the last agreement, the Tories, and at that time Monsieur Bouchard was a minister with Madame Campbell, with Mr. Mulroney, they started to cut every year since 1989, a little bit. And I say to the provinces, when we will renegotiate that next year, we'll sign for 5 years and we'll keep our word, and you will be able to plan your work. That is a big flaw when you don't give them the security of revenues to run their programs.
Let's get to the heart of this problem then. Like the thing the federal government can do to preserve and save health care is to get these transfer payments at a level that'll make it sustaining. Now, what is your commitment? We have a commitment. The highest priority in our spending program is federal support for health care. We make these deep cuts elsewhere, about $19 billion of spending cuts in order to keep that commitment. Now, what specifically is your commitment to the level of federal transfer payments for health care? Would you keep them at the current level? Would you increase them up to 50% where they were years ago?
I said yesterday in replying to Mr. Bouchard that I promised that it will not go down, and I hope that we'll be able to increase that.
Would you increase it?
Yeah,
to what level? To 50%?
I don't know. Can you say to what level you will increase it?
Mr. Bouchard?
Because you cannot do that until
we said
you
we'd keep about 7 to 9 billion.
It is true that you said that to me last night, and that you still tonight pledge to respect the will of the provinces before reducing the levels of the transfer payments. But won't you admit that in 1982, your government was the first to begin such unilateral cuts against the provinces? So why should you believe you tonight if you did it in the past?
You know, Sorry,
Kim Campbell?
I should let Mr. Chrétien answer the question.
No, I say to Mr. Bouchard that, you know, for us, in the plan that we have given to the Canadian public, we say clearly that the transfer payment has to be maintained, and that we have to maintain the same level of transfer for all the programs for the next 5 years, not only Medicare, but university and other social programs. And I'm guaranteed that we'll do that.
Well, the problem with your plan, Mr. Chrétien, is that it's going to lead to higher taxes. It's guaranteed to erode our ability to pay for social programs, because you've agreed that you're going to accept an ongoing perpetual deficit of 3% of the gross domestic product, which in fact is a recipe for bankruptcy. My plan to eliminate the deficit in 5 years, in fact, does not involve cutting social programs. There is a consensus in the healthcare system that there is enough money in the system. It needs to be managed better. And right now, the federal Minister of Health and the provincial ministers of health are working very hard on ways to make that happen. None of the provinces is asking us to scrap the Canada Health Act, and I don't think it's necessary. I agree with Audrey McLaughlin that the importance of our social programs goes far beyond quality of life, although quality of life is in and of itself an extremely important factor. I don't think you can begin to quantify what it means for Canadians. We're a very large country with a very mobile labor force. We want people to be able to make reasonable decisions about where they go to work. If they're worried about portability of their benefits, if they're afraid that accepting a better job someplace else is going to lose them their medical insurance, maybe because they have somebody in their family who's claiming and they're not going to be able to get reinsured, that's a terrible effect on our society. And that is why I have been so determined to show Canadians you do not have to sacrifice our social programs to eliminate the deficit. If we start now and we make the cuts in sensible places, we don't have to touch that. I've set out exactly where I'm going to cut it. More cuts to the cost of government, more cuts to the Department of Defense, more cuts to subsidies to business. I've laid out a very clear Mr. Plan, Mr. Chrétien. You don't have a plan. You don't even recognize that there's a problem.
Mr. Manning, you have
Can I ask you a question, Kim, about, I think that this gets to heart, and it gets maybe back to what Joe is getting at, and you're in the best position to answer this as Prime Minister. Like, is it not true that, like, the federal government spends $160 billion a year, $40 billion on interest, that gives you $120 billion on programs and administration. Of that, $41 billion is going in transfers to individuals, about $26 billion transfers to provinces. In other words, $67 billion. Over half the spending of the federal government is going to transfers. Now, is it possible to cut the deficit and to balance the budget without reforming transfers to individuals and provinces? Doesn't somebody have to bite that bullet? You can't do it by defense cuts or
Well, I've
wage
actually
cuts.
set out a budget that says that you can do that. I mean, people wanted specificity, and I did that.
Wouldn't touch transfers?
In that envelope, I've said we're going to look at, not in that envelope. There's one area that I've left $1.1 billion over that 5-year period to find. And we're looking for that in areas of duplication and overlap between the federal government and the provinces. We've already started that process. We've started to find the savings. It's working very well with Alberta and other provinces.
But are you saying you can balance the budget without touching transfers to individuals and provinces?
Yeah.
Without trusting...
Jean Chrétien, you had a point.
For me, it's unbelievable what the Prime Minister is telling us tonight. You know, she proposed in her speech last week that she was to cut about $1 billion a year, and the deficit is $35 billion. Well, you know, when that came out, it was the laughing stuff of everybody.
No, you were the laughing
Globe and
stock.
Mail in the reality check said that was making no sense. You cut $6 billion out of $35 billion, and you say you will go to zero. La Presse said that it was a big lie. It was a big lie. You know, it's not me.
Mr. Chrétien,
because $6 billion that you're cutting over 5 years, and you have a deficit of $35 billion a year.
No,
Come
you
on.
don't have a deficit.
Be serious.
You're the laughing stock because you know that it's a deficit of $8 billion by 97, 98. You know that.
Campbell, if we could hear Ms. McLaughlin.
September 12th, you said that you want the provinces to be free, to rationalize their services, decide how the healthcare system is run, scrap the Canada Healthcare Act. On September 27th, you said, regarding the wealthy, if they're willing to pay, they could get a higher standard of care. On September 22nd, you said the federal government shouldn't attach strings to transfer payments. Mr. Manning, you have a responsibility to be very clear with Canadians about where you stand on health care. Because to me, what you're saying, and it's either dishonest or naive, I'm just going to cut a big hole in the deck of the boat, and if it sinks, well, that's too bad, but I'll just cut the hole in the boat. Mr. Manning, this is an issue that is dear to the hearts of every Canadian, and you are not being honest about your position.
First of all, Audrey, you'll never find out what the Reform Party stands for by taking excerpts from your clipping service in Ottawa. You want to find out what the Reform Party stands for, you go to our own material. Now, what we've said on health care is very clear. We want to maintain this national standard of health care being available to every Canadian.
And let provinces do what they want. Let provinces charge extra fees. It's very unclear, Mr.
No, we want to maintain that standard. Secondly, we say let the electors in each province direct their provincial government as to how they raise the money for their portion. And thirdly, the thing that federal politicians can do...
user fees. That's a two-tier system.
No, it doesn't have to mean that.
Don't use gobbledygook. You like to say you're not a politician. Talk real language here.
You asked me to explain our position, then you won't let me do it. The thing that we can do as federal politicians, the thing the federal parliament can do, is maintain its transfer payments or increase them. That's the thing we can do in practice, and that's the thing we stand for.
Mr. Bouchard, we have time for one final comment, and Mr. Bouchard...
Mr.
Chrétien,
Medicare free for everybody.
Mr. Chrétien,
congratulations,
Mr. Chrétien, the last point to Mr. Bouchard in terms of this particular issue. Mr.
The problem we have with the Prime Minister's stand on this question of deficit reduction is that there are too many plans that she has published. Last week was the rosy one, but we saw more tough ones in May when she was running the leadership campaign. She said that she would cut about $6 billion in the operating expenses of the government, which is about 1/3 of the budget for operating the government. So which plan must we deal with?
Well,
which plan must we attack?
I'm very happy to answer your question. First of all, Mr. Chrétien is playing fast and loose with the truth, and he knows it. There is a plan in place as of the last budget to take us with very severe expenditure cuts, including $14 billion cuts to the Department of National Defense over the next 5 years, the last government budget, which takes us in 97-98 to an $8 billion deficit. And that's the $8 billion that I have to eliminate between then and the 5th year of my new government. And I've made it very clear how to do that. I've already put in place a restructuring and downsizing of the Canadian government that will result in $3 billion in savings in costs. So I've already acted. The first day I became Prime Minister, I introduced a restructuring that will save $3 billion in cost of government over the next 3 years.
I think whenever I come in, I'm going to be interrupting on this, and I do apologize, Jim Campbell, but I think we will now move on once again. Now to the third subject, and the third topic is Visions of Canada. And Peter Kent, you have a question for Mr. Bouchard.
We're told by the pollsters that the substantial support for the Bloc Québécois in this election is bolstered by significant numbers of disillusioned, disaffected, disenchanted federalists. Mr. Bouchard, you say that the bloc that you bring back to Parliament will make federalism work better for Quebec, but at the same time, you say that your ultimate goal remains sovereignty. My question for 4 of you is, why have you failed to inspire those lost federalists in Quebec with your visions of a stronger Canada? And Mr. Bouchard, how you explain the fundamental contradiction of your platform?
Well, there is no contradiction in the platform of the Bloc. The Bloc is a sovereignist country. The Bloc thinks, with many, many disappointed Quebec federalists, that there is no hope of any change to the status quo. The status quo has been rejected by all Quebecers for the last 30 years. And all the efforts of the political activity in Quebec, all parties, has been to get out of the status quo. Since we know, because of Charlottetown and Meach, that it is not possible to change anything in the federal system, we have to look at something different. And the only solution is sovereignty. That's why the support for the Bloc is not only people who have disillusion. Those people who are not sovereigntists and will vote for the Bloc, I think, I submit very humbly, is because they are sovereigntists in the process, they are federalists in the process of becoming sovereigntists at the next referendum.
Jacques Chrétien?
But for me, I think that building Canada is a work of every day. Canada has been always a fragile nation. I always been a strong federalist in Quebec, and I always have the same speech in Quebec and outside of Quebec, and I have a lot of scars to prove it. But I have to tell you that I'm not a pessimist about Canada. I believe that the majority of the Quebecers, when that will come down to choose, they will always choose Canada because, you know, they intrinsically know very well that if we are still French today, it's because we were part of Canada. The Francophone who were part of the United States, the northern part of the United States have been assimilated. But we had the magic in Canada to make a country where it is possible to be different and equal at the same time. And you know, I'm going across the nation, and I'm excited. Everybody knows that I'm French. You know, I have the proper accent to prove it. And I'm comfortable everywhere. And when I see, as I said yesterday, Madame McLaughlin and Madame Campbell debating in French, that's proving to Mr. Bouchard that Canada is much better today than it was 30 years ago, and we have to keep fighting to keep Canada together.
Kim Campbell.
And I will.
Well, as a British Columbian, I come from a part of the country that sometimes feels frustrated and alienated, a long way from the centre of power. When I go to Quebec, I feel very well accepted, and I speak French like a British Columbian, and I have the accent to prove that. I think what creates that sense of disillusionment and alienation among people very often is the sense that government is not at the service of the people. And I think what we need to do is both to articulate a vision of the country. I think a lot of Quebecers don't know how many tens of thousands of British Columbians send their children to French immersion schools because they believe in the French fact in Canada. I started my political career as a school trustee. I've lived with this issue. And it's very, very important for people in my part of the country to show their belief in Canada and its bicultural and bilingual quality. That's a labor of love for them to do that. But I think most importantly, we have to work to make government credible and to make federalism work for people. Instead of elbowing each other out of the way in jurisdiction, to work together, to use the federal jurisdiction and provincial jurisdictions in a way that puts the citizen at the center to give them better service. That, I think, is going to be very important for convincing Quebecers and other Canadians
Preston
federalism
Manning.
works.
Time is up.
Well, our party, Peter, is really a response to your question. 6 or 7 years ago in the West, there were lots of people who were disillusioned with the way the federal system was working. But rather than try to get out of it or kick it to pieces, what we endeavored to do was put together a new and better federalism. We've asked people for years, what kind of country do you want to live in? And we've come up with a vision of a better federalism, a Canada in which all Canadians and provinces are treated equally regardless of race, language and culture, one where politicians are accountable to the people elect them, one where the budgets are balanced, a new vision of a new Canada. And what we hope to do with respect to Quebec, if we can get a block of members in this next parliament so we're visible there, is to offer a constructive alternative to the old federalists who are not carrying the day in Quebec for whatever reason, and the separatist option, so that Quebec's choice is not old federalism and separation, but do you want to be part of a new Canada or separate? That's our response to that question.
Audrey McLaughlin.
I believe that the majority of Quebecers, like the majority of Canadians, want to be part of a successful Canada. It's not Canada that's a failure. It's the fact that we in this country, and I would lay it at the feet of Liberal and Tory governments, have created horrendous levels of poverty, horrendous levels of unemployment in this country. Look at Montreal. There are many areas that have 25-30% unemployment. I'm sure they don't feel that federalism is working. It's not Canada that's not working. It's the policies that have built on fragmentation, that have pitted one end of the country against another. And I believe that if we're going to offer a country that everybody wants to belong to, we have to build on the things that we share in common. Every Quebecer, as everyone in every other province and territory, wants good schools for their children, wants a good life for their children, wants health care, and wants employment. We, as a country, have something wonderful to share together, and through doing that, it will be our strength, not our weakness.
Peter Kent, you have a follow-up question now for Mr. Bouchard.
Mr. Bouchard, if your only objective in the next Parliament is to get more for Quebec, does that mean that you will oppose aid to Atlantic fishermen or to prairie farmers or the restructuring of social programs, healthcare, daycare, women's issues?
Our mandate will be, in the first part, will be to promote Quebec's interest. We will not have any strings attached to all parties, to overall Canadian imperatives. We will be very much our own men and women for Quebec. But it doesn't mean that we will be unjust. It doesn't mean that we will be stupid. If we think that there are equitable measures to implement for other parts of the country for the time we will be there, of course we will support it. But the main thing is that I don't understand. I hear so many nice words and probably very sincere intentions about harmony, reconciliation, equity, justice, openness, dialogue, everything. And this has been said for the last 3 years up to Charlottetown. We heard so many nice things and so many nice speeches during this time. At the end, it was impossible to recognize Quebec's difference. This is the bottom of the problem. As long as English Canada will not understand that people in Quebec feel to be a people by themselves, a specific collectivity with a strong desire to develop as such, with one government in Quebec, nothing could be achieved. And I think that it's too late now, because English Canada had so many great occasions to achieve it. I was for Meej. I went into politics to implement Meej, and I made a lot of speeches all over Canada for that, and we failed. Well, there is something deep there. It's not because, I'm sure it's not because English Canadians are malevolent, that they don't like Quebecers. Not at all. It's because they have a vision of their country. They have a right to love their country. They have an idea of the country as it should be. And this is utterly respectable, and I respect it. The problem is that Quebecers have a conflicting and as legitimate as their own vision of their own country. So we need an additional country in the land. That's why there is a sovereignist movement in Quebec. That's why there will be a bloc in the House, I hope, because the bloc will reflect a very important element of the political landscape of Quebec. Mr.
Bouchard, if you could let Mr. Chrétien...
for me, I'd like to say to Mr. Bouchard that there is 1 million Francophones outside of Quebec who are as Francophone as you and I, and who wants us to remain in Canada. But if these people, and the people of Quebec too, what they want of us at this moment is not discuss Constitution. I've traveled in Quebec and they tell me, stop talking Constitution. I was in Gaspé and they told me, Mr. Chrétien, if you promise to us that when you will be Prime Minister, you will never talk Constitution, you will die Prime Minister, they said to me. So the people want us to talk about jobs. They want us to talk about, a good society where we can be, have integrity, compassion, sharing. These are the values that the Francophones share with the Anglophone Canadians. We have a lot in common in Canada, and the obsession with the Constitution will never resolve the problem. Madame McLaughlin is right. We have to create a society in Canada that is just and that is generous enough that the Francophone and the Anglophone will live very happy in our land. So that is my view. I've said that for a long, long time. And I'm still a federalist, and Quebec is still in Confederation, and I will quit politics in many years from now, and Quebec will still be part of Canada.
Well, I respect so much Mr. Chrétien's view, but it appears to me such a simplistic view. You dig your head in the sand, you forget that we have a dysfunctional political structure, that decisions cannot be made, the right decisions cannot be made. We have turmoil, quagmire, all sorts of problems, and you refuse to address the problem. You just say it's a constitution, it doesn't mean anything. Constitution is the way decisions are being made. It is the relationship between the states, between the citizens and the state. It's so important. It is the basis of everything. You will never achieve anything to settle the economic problem if you don't do something to streamline your decision-making structure. That's your problem. You're forgetting the main problem.
Well, when you talk about Constitution, you're not talking about the real problem.
Mr. Chrétien, could we let Kim Campbell please make a comment?
Well, the genius of federalism, and I'm probably the only person on this stage who has served at all three levels of government. The genius of federalism is that it allows individual regions and provinces to develop in certain ways on their own, while at the same time creating a national identity and creating national approaches to problems.
In theory.
And we have to develop these things. But I believe very strongly, and I come from a part of the country, as I say, that has often felt resentful of power of Central Canada. It's one reason why I ran for Parliament. And I think the biggest hoax that Mr. Bouchard would like to play on the people of Quebec is to suggest that somehow they can serve their interests sitting in opposition. I can tell you as a British Columbian, that is a recipe for powerlessness that is frustrating, but it will serve Mr. Bouchard's purpose because he really wants wants to discredit federalism in Quebec. So it'll be very good for him.
Done.
It won't be good for Quebecers. But what's interesting is that I believe Quebecers do feel very strongly that they are both Quebecers and Canadians, and that's why your leader, Mr. Parizeau, has said that when Quebec separates, Quebecers will keep their Canadian citizenship. So there's an extraordinary contradiction there, and I believe that Quebecers can be both, just as British Columbians feel very strongly and powerfully that they're British Columbians, but also feel very deeply that they're Canadians. And I understand that duality, and I think it's something that exists throughout the country. But we have created a unique social and political culture in this country that works. The whole really is greater than the sum of its parts. And I think that what Mr. Bouchard is recommending for Quebecers is a recipe for powerlessness in Ottawa and futility in this country.
Reformers,
I'm attacked.
Reformers have
attacked.
two questions that we'd like to bring in, again, to get at the root of this. One is for you, and the one is for these old Iron Party Federalists. The first one is, how do you think sovereigntists in the Canadian Parliament are going to be perceived and received by other people in other parts of the country?
Well, I think they will have to be received. It will be the democratic will of Quebec. Why shouldn't the rest of the country respect the democratic will of Quebec? You don't have any choice. If Quebec decides to do that, it's up to them.
How far do you think that respect is going to be carried? Do you think it's going to be carried to the point of
the beginning,
receptivity?
Maybe. I sincerely hope, because I know the people. They are sincere and honest people. I hope that it will be the beginning of some kind of a dialogue.
Okay. All I would say,
Canada has to hear more about the truth of Quebec.
Yeah, you just
has
don't
to know
want to misjudge
the real message. Mr. Chrétien is a federalist, I understand that, will never deliver the real message of Quebec reality. And Quebec reality is that now a majority of people would like to become sovereign. That's something to take into account.
I have heard that story since 1965, that next year was the last year. And I'm still around. Well, it's not true. I know Quebecers, they like the ambivalence of being, they are very proud of being Quebecer, but they are very happy to be part of Canada, and they don't want basically to choose.
They don't dislike Canada. They don't dislike Canada, but they know that Canada doesn't fulfill their aspirations, and they have a people's aspirations. They want to fulfill them in their own way, in their own political structure.
Audrey McLaughlin, you had a point. Audrey McLaughlin.
Bouchard, we're all sincere about our position, and we respect that you are too. We respect that you are too. But there are a couple of perplexing questions. You want to come to Ottawa to make Canada fail. That's
no, that's not true.
Yes, Mr. Bouchard,
Excuse me, that's not true.
And one of the major things that has made Quebecers feel left out, as many other Canadians, is that in 1988 you sold the very policies, the free trade deal, the GST, you sold that in Quebec. You as a conservative member of the cabinet said, this is a solution, this is what I support, and that's what you did in 1988, wow. Mr. Bouchard. And now you're saying, well, I think Canadian taxpayers should pay us to come to Ottawa to help make Canada fail.
Well, about
I think that is something that most
let me say something about that. This is very important,
Okay,
because it's about legitimacy. Well, I have no problem going to Ottawa with my salary paid by the taxes of Quebec. Quebec sovereignists are paying taxes. No taxation without representation. Those people have been paying taxes, heavy taxes to Ottawa for so many years. Those taxes have been used against them to promote federalism. Now is the time when they will decide to send sovereignists to Ottawa just to represent them. We are not trying to destroy federalism, not trying to destroy Canada.
Okay, but there's one other question that better be asked.
Let's be honest.
Preston Manning.
It's already done.
You've got to be really careful in reading the mood of the rest of the country towards sovereignty. But the question for the old Federalist parties is the one that you started out on, is why have you not been able to sell federalism more effectively in Quebec? Two full-blown separatist movements have grown up under the Liberals and Conservatives. Isn't what's happening in Quebec is not that the sovereigntists are any stronger than they were in 1980. It's that the Federalists and their representation of federalism in Quebec are weaker. That's why we see this demand for a new federalism, some third option to offer Quebec.
If, Mr. Manning, you're proposing to me to get back at the constitutional table next month after I will become Prime Minister,
we're not saying
forget about it. I won't be there. I want to deal with the jobs and economic growth. That's what the Quebecers want today. This is the problem. But
so
it's easy when you don't want to talk about the real problem. You say, I have the solution for new federalism. Federalism is a complex system, but works.
But do you acknowledge acknowledge, do you even acknowledge that old Federalists are losing the constitutional battle in Quebec and that something new and dramatic has to be done?
But in 1903, I guess, Mercier, who was then the Premier of Quebec, voted the separation of Quebec from Canada, a little bit like Joseph Howe did in 1869 in Nova Scotia. This has always been there. And I'm I know it will always be there. There is always some people who will want to fight that. But we have shown to the world that it is possible to have a country with two official languages that work. And that we can have a different type of people in Canada. And it is an example to the world. There will be a lot of talks about it, but talks is not dangerous.
But what Quebecers and all Canadians want, they want government to work. They want government to work for them. They don't want government to put the Constitution in the middle of their agenda. They want people to be in the middle of their agenda. What Quebecers want is for all levels of government to work together to serve them. That's why the first thing that I did as Prime Minister was to call a meeting of the First Ministers, and I've been working with them over the summer. That's why I've said I wouldn't change social programs unilaterally. That's why I've said we have to have a national strategy on deficit and debt, because it's a problem we all share together. That's why I've been working with the provinces, and particularly with Quebec, because Quebec's been out in advance on this, in developing a labour market development program that will provide for Quebecers and for the rest of Canadians for the first time some real strategic planning on training them for the labour force. That instead of bickering with one another and trying to elbow one another out of the way, and governments working at cross purposes with the private sector, we're going to bring people together.
We're going to bring people together will be now the out cue, as they say, of this section, and I'd like to, Kim Campbell, I'd like to now move on to our fourth issue. And Leslie Jones, you have a question on social issues, which is the fourth topic, and you have your question for Preston Manning.
There are a myriad of social issues that Canadians are talking about in this campaign, but one is the subject of a whisper campaign happening on the doorsteps. It's immigration. Voters are saying immigrants are responsible for crime in this country, that they're abusing the welfare system. Studies show that that is not true. But why are most of you not addressing it as an issue, addressing the intolerance? Is it, as some of your MPs suggest, that you're afraid to confront it because it's so volatile? Now, I know, Mr. Manning, this comes up at some of your meetings. We'll start with you.
Okay, well, we have addressed the issue of immigration. We have a clear policy on it. We're a pro-immigration party. That would be expected given our roots in Western Canada. What we argue is that Canada's immigration policy ought to be based primarily on Canada's economic and labour force requirements. In other words, if the Government of Canada can demonstrate that a given level of immigration is a long-term net economic benefit to Canada, it should be supported. If it can't, then that level should be adjusted until it can. We believe if you look at the current levels of immigration of around 200 to 250,000 per year, that there's several studies now that indicate that is too high under the current circumstance and would be better lowered to about 100 to 150,000 per year. But that's basically our policy. It's a pro-immigration, essentially driven by Canada's economic and labour force requirements.
Kim Campbell.
Well, two things. First of all, of the about 250,000 immigrants who will come into Canada this year, about 100,000 are independent or business immigrants and their families, and they come in specifically to create economic activity. The rest are mostly family reunification for people who are already here. When I restructured the government in June, I created a Department of Human Resources, which includes all of our approaches to training, all of our approaches to income security, and our approaches to creating immigration policy. In other words, the policy about who comes to Canada and how many immigrants that we can successfully assimilate into our society every year is made precisely in the context of Canada's labour market needs. That's always been the case, and it will continue to be the case. I think what's important is to make sure that we have the proper follow-up services. And as somebody who served at 3 levels of government, including at the municipal level as a school trustee, there's always been this tension about who pays for language training, etc. And I think we can do better in making sure that we provide the services necessary to integrate immigrants very quickly into Canadian society. But they are without question an economic plus, and our policy is based on that economic analysis.
Audrey McLaughlin.
Well, I'm interested that you say that none of the political parties have addressed immigration. I guess you can't always believe what you don't read in the paper. I've talked a lot about immigration because I think it is very important. And unfortunately, there are those parties that are, I believe, promoting a sense that immigrants are a drag on this country. Many of us here, unless any of us among us are First Nations people, immigrants, our parents were immigrants, our grandparents were immigrants. I want to say that we support that 1% annually of the Canadian population should be the immigrants that are admitted to this country. We support a compassionate refugee program with proper controls, and if people are not meeting the requirements, obviously they should not be let in. But one of the things that we have to see is equal access to immigration services for women, access to language training, both in French and English, and I'd challenge Ms. Campbell, because I see in this secret document about proposed changes, she's looking at cuts to the immigrant settlement program. I believe that immigrants are a strength of this country and not a weakness, as someone would say.
Jean Chrétien.
For me, I cannot disagree, because we seem to be all in agreement that immigration is a very positive force in our society. Of course it had been. That's the way that Canada was created. You know, when in the end of the last century, when Laurier was the Prime Minister, he opened the West. And in order to create wealth in Canada, he got the people coming from all over the world to build this part of Canada. So this land of ours is very big, and there's still a lot of opportunity. And when an immigrant comes to Canada, you have to realize that he becomes an asset right away, because we don't have to pay for his education. You don't have to pay for most of the things. He arrives ready to be a consumer. So I think that having 1% of our population as immigrants in Canada, it is something that we can do. And there is another element too, is despite of our problems, we're still a rich country, and we should open our doors to people who look at Canada as the best land in the world.
Lucien Bouchard.
We're all in agreement on that.
That's a point where the Bloc will agree with all the parties in the House, because the Bloc strongly supports immigration. In Quebec, for example, I think that Quebec is a better place, more open place, a richer place, since we have opened the doors to immigration. It's not easy, because we have to set up a French policy to integrate people. We have an accord with the federal government. It doesn't work too bad. This is one sector where it has been possible to discuss openly with the federal government. There should be some improvement in the accord, but on the whole, I think that immigration should be one of the values of Canada. We should be all prized. I was in Europe for 3 years as an ambassador. I traveled extensively around the world. We have a great reputation for that. We should really try hard to keep it.
That's why we don't want to break Canada. We have a great reputation.
Okay.
We don't... Okay, excuse me.
We are now back to Leslie Jones for a follow-up question to Mr. Manning.
Mr. Manning, Canada continues to evolve as a multiracial society. If you were making immigration policy, would you continue to support that evolution or not?
Yes, our immigration policy is completely racially neutral. We say country of origin, ethnicity ought not to be a factor at all in immigration policy. That's partly why we lean so heavily on the economic criteria. I do think, you know, in response to your early question, while it really is all the sweetness and light here, we're agreeing for once on one thing. I think what we're agreeing on is the general principle that immigration is good and that it ought to be driven by, you know, Canada's requirements. I think the more relevant question that a lot of people watching want to know is, do all the parties support the current level of immigration at 200 and 250,000? Or do some feel it should be lowered under the current circumstances? Our position is that it should be lowered to that 100 to 150,000 level. Is everybody, are we in agreement on that? If we are, we can maybe even save some time.
Well, Mr. Manning, I think I've been very clear that we support the 1%.
And what does that work out to? What does that work out to?
1% of the population.
Yeah, it works out to how many then? Or in excess of 250,000.
Please allow me to finish. And but, you know, an important part of that is you talked earlier about the economy. We have to do to build the economy. Let's not forget that immigrants both contribute to the economy, are consumers in the economy, provide a market internally for our economy. And you seem to be ignoring that and in some way saying that, and I think your philosophy, and we've had this debate before, that all Canadians should just be the same, also denies the reality of Canada when we see that 2/3 of Canadians now are neither a British or French heritage.
And don't we know that? Don't we know that? We'll come from Western Canada. Western Canada was multicultural before Toronto had heard the word.
But Mr. Manning, you would restrict that. I come from the north, and in the north we've had Vietnamese boat people. You think that would be a strange place for people to go, but they have been tremendously successful business people and contributors to the north and to Canada.
So you support a level as high as present or even higher, about 270,000 per year.
Yes.
No, I'd be interested in other people.
No, I don't want to get into a numbers game and bidding or overbidding. I just say that it's good. And for us, the current level of immigration in Canada is not a bad one. I think that 250,000 people a year, the economy can absorb it. Because, you know, you have to realize that when they arrive here, they are consumers the first day. They buy a car, they buy a house, they buy furniture. So, you know, they are a very positive asset and they work very hard. And it's very rare that you find them, you know, in difficulties. They tend to work together. The family are helping each other. The different groups are helping each other to find a proper place. So for us, it's very good. Nobody has proven to me that this level is too high today. If it were to cause unemployment and cause social problems, I will not hesitate to revisit, but nobody has been able to make the case that they are causing problem at this time.
Well, if I can, perhaps speak up a word for the new federalism that Mr. Manning talks about, I think the most important thing with immigration policy is that it be intelligent. And it is, in fact, an area of shared jurisdiction in Canada. And we've been looking to enter into agreements with the provinces to help create well-targeted, sensitive policies in terms of immigration and immigrant settlement that meet the needs of individual provinces. And Quebec, of course, was one of the pioneers there. And I'm delighted to hear that Mr. Bouchard thinks the Accord is a positive thing, because I understand he voted against it. But I think it is a model.
No, it was done when the Liberals were in power. He was not there in those days.
No, I think we signed.
I was there.
Thank you. We signed an agreement. Well, maybe this is.
Does everybody know where they were now? And
I've been around for a long time.
Well, we had a recent agreement.
I intend to be around for another many more years.
Well, there were changes to the agreement that Mr. Bouchard voted against. The point is that it is an area of policy where the country is very different. We've made changes to the Immigration Act that enable us to direct immigrants to certain parts of the country. Although once they're there, I mean, the mobility rights in the Charter are there, and they're free to go where they want. The important thing is that the policy reflect the needs of Canadians, and I think you can't answer the question of the numbers games unless you can show that there's a explicit reason to do that. I come from a part of the country that's one of the major receivers of immigration, Vancouver. The most important thing there, the city has been enormously enriched by it, as has Toronto. I mean, Toronto, which used to be the dullest place ever, is actually a wonderful place, but it does put the enormous numbers of immigrants do challenge us to have the services necessary to make sure people can integrate quickly into Canadian society, and that's the challenge.
Well,
and unless proven otherwise, I think the current levels are working
Campbell,
well.
I'm even going to agree with Mr. Manning for a minute and say it is very sweetness and light here. But why would your government put immigration together in the reorganization with public security? Why are you saying to immigrants that you can be treated as criminals? What have immigrants got to do with policing? And why, of all the other departments, would you choose the Department of Security? I find this incredible, and I find it insulting and unacceptable.
Well, perhaps you ought to read the policy, because the restructuring of government puts all of the policy with respect to immigration into the Human Resources Department, and it makes it very clear that the Government of Canada regards immigrants as valuable human resources. But the Government of Canada...
Are they not in the Department of Security?
But the enforcement of the law, in terms of the things that protect Canadian security, goes into one department. The problem with the Government of Canada is that we have law enforcement responsibilities that were divided between half a dozen different departments. It was an extremely costly way of performing services for Canadians. And there are aspects of law enforcement that happen to relate to immigration, that happen to relate to the security of our borders, that were previously a national revenue, that happen to relate to other aspects of our national integrity that have been brought into that department. But it's like saying we don't want people to, that we're treating people who cross the border as criminals because we're putting that enforcement in the Department of Public Security.
I've talked to people across this country whose parents were immigrants or they're immigrants.
Distorting the policy.
You say, Ms. Campbell, that you want to listen to Canadians. I have not talked to one person who's first-generation immigrant who isn't insulted by this policy that could have been combined with external affairs. There were many options. But to give, by combining with public security, to give the impression to immigrants that they're in a policing department,
it seems
what I would like to do.
Clearly not.
Nobody's giving that impression.
What I would like to do at this point, actually, is to go back to Leslie Jones. There are so many issues in the area of social issues. Perhaps, Leslie, there is now a second area that you would like to raise that you can address to one of the leaders.
Yeah, we'd like to raise the issue of violence in society. There are a growing number of Canadians who are fearful about crime. They think it's out of control. Women are particularly vulnerable, and families fear for their children. Ms. Campbell, I'd like to address this to you. There have been a number of cases over the past several years where high-risk offenders have been released from prison early, only to commit the same crimes again. Why did it take your government until May of this year to come up with a proposal to keep high-risk offenders, dangerous criminals, in prison indefinitely?
Well, I think we've done an enormous amount to try and make Canada safer. Doug Lewis, as Solicitor General, brought in some very significant changes to the Parole Act, which really have strengthened the hands of the courts, have strengthened the hands of parole boards in terms of violent and dangerous offenders. As Justice Minister, I brought in equivalent changes to the Criminal Code with respect to sentencing, once again, to put tools in the hands of the courts to make sure that they had the tools that they needed in terms of sentencing to keep people who were a danger to society in jail for a period of time in terms of their eligibility for parole. The two Justice and Solicitor General had to work together. But Minister Lewis, in fact, did respond very quickly to the need to create a new Dangerous Offenders Act that would deal with that issue. He brought it forward in May, and after the election, it would be one of my highest priorities to enter it quickly into Parliament and have it quickly passed to deal with the problem that you're talking about, which is a loophole in the law that results from the merging of sentences.
Preston Manning?
We've advocated a complete overhaul of the criminal justice system. We think you've got to overhaul the parole board, particularly the patronage appointments to it, which undermine the whole thing. We also think you should tighten up the Young Offenders Act. We've got a number of proposals to drop the age of application to get greater public and media access to that. We advocate the abolition of automatic parole and greater certainty in sentencing, the automatic deportation of non-citizens convicted of serious crimes, a binding national referendum on capital punishment, and a much higher priority to victims' rights, victim compensation, and victim rehabilitation, which particularly gets into doing something proactive with respect to women and children that are the victims of violence. And I think what a lot of people watching tonight want with respect to the criminal justice system is for the protection of the life and property of the citizen to be the number one priority of that system.
Audrey McLaughlin?
Well, I'd like to say that I agree that people feel that crime is increasing, and some of Statistics Canada doesn't quite agree with that, and statistically. However, it is a feeling in the community. I had a community safety panel in my own community, and there were three things that people were very clear about. Violent criminals must pay the price, and I agree. Secondly, we must limit the number of arms available. And thirdly, we have to make sure that we are ensuring that for violence against women, we adopt a zero-tolerance policy of violence against women. If we believe it, we'll do it. But we must also address this issue from another perspective that none of the other leaders have approached, and that is the area of prevention. We know that unemployment, poverty contribute to the causes of crime. It costs more than $50,000 a year to incarcerate a criminal. It costs $12,000 a year to send someone to university. We have to also attack the root causes. Doesn't mean that we aren't very strong, particularly in the areas of violence, but we have to also look at the root causes.
John Chrétien?
But for me, I agree that we have to have tougher gun control laws. For me, I don't think that handguns should be available as easily as it is. It's all right to be a hunter, but why to let people have handguns in Canada? I don't think we need that type of thing. We have to have much tougher laws there. We have to reform, as been mentioned, the Young Offenders Act. We have to have a real fight to make sure that we have tough laws against violence, on women, because it's been a big problem in our society, and zero tolerance should be the objective of everybody. But the problem that we have to talk about very much is it's coming, as Madame McLaughlin said, it's the roots, where it's coming from. And it's always when you have poverty in the family, when the people are not working, when there is misery. That is where, these problems develop more. And it's why we say that we have to give priority to the dignity of every citizen, that they can have a job, that we have a better system where people are more comfortable with themselves. And if we don't address these problems of work and no more welfare and unemployment for nothing, but let them contribute to society, they will feel good about themselves and there will be much less crime. And it's why we say jobs, it's our priority number one.
Mr. Bouchard, you had a point?
Yes. I think that violence, and mainly violence against women, is the ugly face of our society. This is something we should unite against, and I think that we missed a great occasion to do something much more intense as an effort. After the horrible killing of the University of Montreal, and all those girls were killed savagely by someone we heard about, we had an occasion then to mobilize people in Canada to have a tough harm control law. And we failed. We tried in the House to toughen up the law, and the government couldn't resist to the lobby from people, hunters, and all those people who love to have guns at home. But I think that we should revisit the law. And it's one thing to work at the root of the problem, and I agree with you, Mr. Chrétien, but it's also, we have also to work on the manifestation of the problem. And a tougher gun control law should be of the order.
With that, I would like to now...
a little point that I
A
would like to
little
mention.
point, Mr. Chrétien, a little point.
Yes, I just said that we have to deal with the problem of violence on TV too. That is a very big problem these days. And it's more in concern in Canada and the United States, but it's a very high priority because, you know, I'm sure that it's causing a lot of people just to try to do it because they see it too much.
Thank you, Mr. Chrétien. Now I would like to move to our fifth and final segment. The topic is the deficit. Joe Schlesinger, I believe you have a question for Kim Campbell.
Well, let's hope we aren't going to have any violence on TV here. A dozen years ago, high inflation and interest rates were the big problem. Once we got them down, we were told our economy would regain its health. Well, they are down, and as Canada as a whole doesn't feel any better about it. Now we are told the deficit is the problem. You've outlined various deficit-cutting plans that have achieved a rare feat indeed, a consensus among economists. Most say your figures just don't add up, that they're a numbers game. So the question is, why should Canadians believe that your plans will work, that they won't just make things worse?
Well, first of all, I'm the only party leader who has a plan both to eliminate the deficit and to create jobs. And the only realistic plan to eliminate the deficit, because if you think there's a problem with my numbers, you should see Mr. Manning's. And Mr. Chrétien doesn't even recognize the problem. He's prepared to entertain deficits in perpetuity. There's a very simple reason why the deficit has to be eliminated, because it is, as I say, the ticking time bomb that is eating away at our resources and putting all of our other programs in jeopardy. The only criticism of my deficit plan, it is in fact a complete and an open one, and it will work, it is realistic. The only criticism made by economists is with respect to the projections on economic growth. We're all using the same projections, and I've made it very clear that if those projections are off, in my plan over 5 years, there can be corrections every year. But there has to be a plan, there has to be a commitment to eliminate the deficit. And our party is the only party that recognizes that has a plan that does not put our social programs at risk, that does not simply displace the problem under the problems as Mr. Manning's plan does, and raise taxes.
Thank you, Kim Campbell. Now, I'm sorry to interrupt. Lucien Bouchard.
Well, the deficit is the monster. It is the real enemy. Some people talk about jobs, 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 and they don't do anything about it. It's very good in politics to talk about jobs, 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 like Mr. Chrétien does, for example, very effectively. But we can't create jobs if we don't control the deficit. This is the dark face of what we have to do in government. And I personally feel threatened by your plan, Madame, because your plan is so utterly inadequate that it is a danger for all of us. I feel threatened when I think about the burden that will fall on the shoulder of my children, because you have nothing to fight the deficit. You can say we have a deficit plan, a plan to reduce deficit. We all know, and you personally know, that it doesn't work. You base it on rosy predictions, which have been the laughingstock of all economists when Mr. Mazinkowski made them. He never succeeded to achieve any of his prediction, and here you are basing your predictions on that. And Mr. Chrétien is doing the same. That's the worst thing of all.
Jean Chrétien, we will now give...
Oh, yes, thank you very much. On page 111 in this book, Madame Campbell, we say that we're cutting expenditures more than the money that we'll spend in new program to kickstart the economy, including your helicopters. It's all there. We want to reduce the deficit. And this plan, we have been very clear. We took 2 years to make this plan. It was not made on the back of an envelope like your plan that you've shown to us last week. But what is important at this time is to control expenditures, but the best way to reduce the deficit is to get the people working. When they are working, they pay taxes. They increase the wealth of the nation. And today, the IMF and the G7 last week said to us, Canadians, and to Germans and to the Americans, stop fighting deficit and inflation. The problem number one is to create jobs and growth. And we were saying that to the Canadians since a year and a half. So that is the solution, to control expenditures, but increase the growth in the economy and the number of jobs.
Audrey McLaughlin.
I don't think we need to have a debate about whether the deficit is a problem, whether the Tories, in fact, have doubled the debt. That's clear. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Ministry of Finance came out with a study that indicated that the Tory government, Ms. Campbell, was not going to reach her deficit targets because of a shortfall of revenues directly related to unemployment. You cannot attack the debt and the deficit without some plan to get people back working. And that's why we've come forward with a plan. Now, Mr. Manning says he'll reduce the deficit in 3 years. It is clear that that could create another 300,000 unemployed. That is not the price that this country can afford to pay. Mr. Manning says he'd take $3.5 billion from seniors. Why should seniors pay the price of a deficit reduction problem? Yes, we can reduce waste. Yes, we can have more efficiency in government. Yes, we can ensure that our expenditures are well targeted and well spent, but we will not attack it unless we get people back working. That unemployment is free is a myth.
Preston Manning.
Well, we have a concrete plan as well for reducing the deficit. We've had this out. We've spread over 3 million copies of this around the country, and it is very specific on how to reduce the federal deficit to zero in 3 years, and we'll defend the numbers in this if people want to get into a numbers argument. The reason we're concerned about this, of course, is because we think the deficit's at the root of the deterioration of the social programs, the deterioration of the private sector job-creating capacity, and high taxation. Now, the big difference between us and the Conservatives is that we're prepared to vote against government motions to spend public money. The Conservatives have made all sorts of nice speeches about deficit, and this is true of yourself, Kim, it's true of the Conservative candidate I'm running against in Calgary Southwest, that you have never, ever voted against a government appropriation to spend money in your life.
I've never voted against a cut in expenditures either.
You don't get deficits down by talking about it. You get it by voting against government expenditure.
Thank you, Preston Manning. And now, Joe Schlesinger, if you have a follow-up question for Kim Campbell.
I think we're back where we started. And the subject is credibility. It was that with the jobs, it is that with the deficit. Most people don't know how you cut deficits. But when they see deficit plans that are based on figures that they know are wrong, when those figures are produced by the finance ministry that has made predictions about budget deficit for years, and they've always been wrong, well, then you know that you're building something on sandcastles, and that the trouble we're having as the media, the trouble you are having as politicians, is that people look at this and they just don't believe. How are you going to answer that?
Well, first of all, I want to state again my commitment to eliminate the deficit in 5 years, because I think unless we do that, this country is in serious trouble. I've made, first of all, an unalterable commitment not to increase taxes, because I don't think we can afford to increase taxes. I think that's economically destructive and will kill the goose that lays the golden eggs of job creation. I've started out in a significant downsizing and restructuring of government. The first day I became Prime Minister, I put my money where my mouth is, and I did what people said couldn't be done. I decreased the size of cabinet by 10. I restructured the government to make savings, and these are well documented, of $3 billion over 5 years. I've added, now Mr. Chrétien does not have $35 billion worth of cuts in his approach to cut the deficit, which means he accepts the fact that we have expenditure cuts going on now as a result of the last budget and decisions before that will in fact take us on the Department of Finance it estimates to $8 billion in deficit the year before I'm planning to eliminate the deficit. So I've proposed another $5.8 billion additional cuts over that 5 years. There'll be another $500 million savings in interest, and I've indicated that I want to sit down with the provinces to find that other $1.1 billion, but also to create a national debt management plan. You can't just offload the problem onto the provinces because they'll raise your taxes. There has to be a national strategy to deal with our national debt and indebtedness. $60 billion national deficit as well as a $32 billion
Lucien Bouchard.
Now, I've said my number. Look, my light
Kim
hasn't
Campbell,
gone on
if
yet.
we could now,
The point is,
Lucien Bouchard has a comment. There is no light in this particular, no flashing light saying time out.
No light.
Lucien Bouchard.
I would like to tell you I'm really worried by what you say, because we all know that your plan has already blown up.
where is your plan?
Your plan, the
No,
last
but where
one.
is yours?
Well, the last one. Not the next one, not the one
But where
before.
is your plan?
Your current plan. Let me ask you a question.
Where is your plan?
You want to be Prime Minister in former government. Let me ask you a question. We all know that the first year, the starting point of your deficit reduction plan is the current year's deficit. The estimate is at about $32.6 billion. We know from the Ministry of Finance that for the first 4 months, you are already overdrawn by at least $3 billion. So will you persist in keeping this estimate as $32.6 billion, or do you admit with Claude Pichet, the financial analyst from Le Journal La Presse of Montreal, that we are headed toward a deficit of $40 billion this year? What is your position on this? What is your estimate now?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball either. All I can do is work.
Well, you know it.
All I can do is work with the numbers that are there
figures.
and commit to correct them. The fundamental thing is the commitment to eliminate the deficit. I've made that commitment over 5 years. There are cuts in place in the system. And what I've said is that as soon as the election is over, I will table in Parliament a complete up-to-date statement of our financial situation.
Isn't that too late?
Put before the Parliamentary Committee options for deficit reduction. Get the input of the Canadian people on setting priorities. Now, I have set out a plan that, given the existing projections, will take us
Jean Chrétien has been trying to get in.
But I've indicated that plan has to be corrected based on economic changes. It's too early in the fiscal year to know, in fact, where we're going to be on the deficit.
Jean Chrétien,
you know that.
Kim
Yes,
Campbell.
I heard all that in '84. You know, the fresh new face of the day, Mr. Mulroney, said to us that he was to reduce the deficit and he was to reduce the debt. For 9 years, we had an average of more than $32 billion of deficit a year, and the debt went from $160 to $460 billion. So I have been Minister of Finance, and all these plans...
That was the problem.
No. 5 years plan, you say that it will go there. I'll give you an example from your own books. Your own Minister of Finance 4 years ago predicted for this year that the deficit was to be, for last year, to be $14 billion. Every year it was revised upward until it was 35. This year they made a prediction for 32. The Minister of Finance says it might be, it will be higher. Some predict 40. So when you're there, there's so many elements there that to come and make this big promise that I, Preston Manning, or I, Kim Campbell, I will reduce the deficit to zero. It's a promise that is empty because there is so many factors coming into play that nobody can do that.
I'd like to address the issue of credibility.
Audrey McLaughlin.
I'd like to address the issue of credibility. We've all read the International Monetary Funds. We've read the articles in the press. But I want to talk about what the people in my riding say about credibility. About the miner who's unemployed, 100 of them in Faro, Yukon, who just wants to get training. And they hear Ms. Campbell talk about training. They go for training. There's 4 spots for those 100 people. I want to talk about credibility and why people don't believe Ms. Campbell's deficit plan or Mr. Manning's. Because Ms. Campbell says that I want to make sure that people are employed. I have a jobs plan. And yet our policies have thrown people out of work, and what she's done in my own riding is to lay off the very counsellors for employment that get people back to work. That's why there's a credibility gap. Words aren't enough. The Tory government has undermined the confidence of Canada, not just in their own policies, but in politics, by ignoring Canadians and by saying one thing and doing another.
Well, and we address this credibility question on 2 levels. First of all, we have specifics. In our 3-year program, we get into what is to be preserved, what is to be cut, dollar amounts, targets. We have the most specific deficit reduction program if people want to get into the specifics.
But your numbers
if that's
are
how
off
you
the
get
wall.
credit.
But how does it affect people?
Okay, let me
Couldn't we just once
the
talk
second
about
thing you
people?
need, and this gets to the heart of Joe's question, is if people don't believe the politicians, we have this thing, so you don't trust the politicians, neither do we, then let's change the system. The other
why do
thing
you
we
want to
bring to the
go in the House
picture
of
is
Commons,
measures
Mr.
to
Manning?
make political people more accountable to those elected. That's why we favor these freer votes in the House of Commons, including freer votes on money matters, and a recall mechanism that if politicians do not perform what they promised in elections, the electors can get at it. Now, I think the combination of specificity and detail, plus giving voters a mechanism to get back at elected politicians if they fail to make promises, that's how you get credibility.
Mr. Chrétien?
I would like to ask a question of Mr. Manning. The most important and the richest nation in the world, country in the world, is the United States. Can you tell me how many times since 1932 they had zero deficit in their budget?
No, they haven't had a zero deficit.
And they became the richest country in the world anyway. So that proved one thing, is the deficit
John,
is one thing.
what are you saying?
No, I just say to you that the problem is you have to finance your operation.
But the Americans have a huge debt.
Let me ask, what are you saying? This is a former finance minister saying that the more you spend, the better off you'll be?
I say that there is not a country
what would
in the
happen
world.
if these people out there follow that philosophy?
Remember after the war, we had a big debt in Canada, a big debt, bigger than today.
Yeah.
And we managed to get out of it.
You had a whole...
Because we created growth. We invited immigrants to come to Canada. We created jobs. That is the way that we've done it. And eventually, there was always a deficit.
No, but Jean, that, you had a huge pent-up consumer demand in the war that drove the system. You do not have that today. You have disposable income of consumers going down because of high tax levels. You do not have a parallel situation today. And if you base your finance policy on that, you'd get us in deeper soup.
But let's talk about this question of credibility on the deficit, though, Mr. Manning, because you say that you have a plan and your numbers don't add up.
No, they do.
Your growth projections are as optimistic, if not more optimistic, than the ones that are the basis of my deficit reduction plan.
But less optimistic than your finance department.
You are suggesting, for example, that you can get $3.5 billion out of old age security. And you say, well, it'll only affect family incomes over $54,000. Now, economists say, no, in fact, you'd have to claw back every cent of old age security for family incomes over $35,000. Your own research director... Let me finish. Just because they're in my writing. There's a lot of things in my writing I don't agree with. Just your own research director has now backpedaled and said, no, it's probably $45,000. The fact of the matter is, you want to solve the problem of the deficit on the back of the old.
No, we don't.
On the back of the poor. You want $4 billion out of unemployment insurance. You're going to have to add payroll taxes.
Let me ask
you're
you
going to
again.
Put a burden. Let me finish, because you are talking about credibility.
Are you saying you can balance the budget?
Your numbers are completely bogus.
But are you saying you can balance?
You would offload to the provinces and increase people's taxes. It's a completely bogus approach.
Let me ask you this one fundamental question. Are you saying you can balance the federal budget without touching transfers to individuals or provinces? Yes or no?
I have put forward a plan.
Yes or no?
To balance the budget by 1998-99 based on the existing projections that does not touch those. Now,
well, you go ask your
what we have to do is
Lucien Bouchard.
Your approach would kill the economy.
Lucien Bouchard.
Ms. Campbell, and another figure that will have a big influence on the credibility of your deficit reduction plan is the real deficit of the last completed fiscal year.
Mm-hmm.
What is the real deficit? Usually we know it by August or September. We are in October, we still don't know it. And I think that you should tell the population what has been the real deficit of last year. You should say that, because you have the obligation to inform the public about public accounts.
What's at issue here is the choice between a party on the one hand that doesn't even think the deficit is a problem, that thinks that we can
I had a question. Is that the answer?
Is that the answer? That thinks that we can sustain
simple
a deficit
figure.
of 3%
what is the real deficit?
of our gross domestic product in perpetuity.
You're hiding it.
He doesn't see the problem. Mr. Manning,
you're hiding the truth, madam.
Let me finish.
You're hiding this figure
Mr. Manning
because it will destroy your credibility of your plan.
that would be on the back of the poor, that would be on the back of the middle
you don't
class,
answer the question.
that won't work, and will kill the economy and simply increase taxes. What you're saying about me is...
I don't say anything. Ask you a question.
That I have a plan to eliminate the deficit.
You don't
and
have
you're
a
asking
plan.
the question. I have a very clear plan to eliminate the deficit,
but
that it may need some corrections. The
But you
point
don't
is
answer the question.
That I'm committed to
What
doing
is the real
it.
deficit of last year? It's a simple question. Yes or no?
Well, what is the alternative?
There is no alternative for the truth.
Corrected.
What is the figure?
There is no alternative. You have no alternative. Give us your alternative
The only
plan.
alternative is not to answer my question. And you have selected
What is
it.
your plan to eliminate
Madam
the
Campbell,
deficit?
I think that the decibel level in this room... Mr. Chrétien, I'm afraid that we are now going to close this particular section. And this is bringing then to an end, if my ears here, to the debate section. And I thank you all very much. But we now turn to the audience. And as you can imagine, this is not a random group of people who simply wanted a trip to Ottawa. Rather, they were carefully selected by an independent research company. They come from all over Canada, and we are told that they are uncommitted to any party. Each questioner has been asked to address one and only one leader and to keep their questions brief and to the point. The order of respondents for the first 5 questions has been predetermined, but after that there are no guidelines. The audience's questions control who is given the opportunity to speak. Peter Kent, I understand that you have someone with a question for Jean Chrétien.
Yes, and a question for Mr. Chrétien from Andrew Murphy from St. John's, Newfoundland.
Our main concern, Mr. Chrétien, is our fisheries. Declare a complete moratorium to all zones of fishing around Newfoundland and Maritimes. Joint management as proposed by Premier Wells and Fisheries Minister Carter. External extension to the 200-mile limit on the nose and tail of the Grand Banks, and deploy the frigates to control the bow. We feel that this will be a boost to unemployment and eventually a reduction in the deficit. I hope you will respond to those concerns if and when you get elected. Thank you.
Yes, I will. I cannot deal with all of them, but I'd like to talk about the nose and tail of the Grand Banks. It's unacceptable that we have a moratorium for Canadian fishermen who go out to catch usually the cod and they cannot touch it. When we see in the nose and the tail of the banks, somebody coming from Spain or Portugal catching the fishes there. We have a protection, the responsibility to protect the species, but we cannot let these people take the fish at the nose and the tail. When I was Minister of Northern Affairs, unilaterally I extended the jurisdiction of Canadian authorities over the water in the Arctic for pollution purposes. Now we have to do that for the nose and the tail, because it is for the protection of the cod stocks. And we'll do that. Some people say you cannot do that. We've done it in the past. If we're acting in the interest of the protection of the stocks, the people will agree with us. It is, and eventually that will become the law of the world, just like we extended the limit eventually to 200 miles.
Thank you, Mr. Chrétien. And Leslie Jones, you have someone, I understand, with a question for Kim Campbell.
I'm here with Catherine Rupertus from Victoria, BC. You have a question for Ms. Campbell.
Yes. When the GST was brought in, I thought that was going to completely pay off the deficit. And it wasn't even mentioned by any of you tonight. And it's a most hated tax in Canada.
Well, the GST isn't enough in and of itself to pay off the deficit. But we passed legislation to ensure that all GST revenues would go, in fact, to pay the deficit. They would not be used to finance new government programs. And at the same time, we brought in legislation to limit the growth of government program spending to 3%. We actually have now frozen government spending, so it's even less than that. There's no increase even to allow for inflation. So the GST revenues are not being used to finance new programs. They are being used to help us balance our books and get our fiscal house in order.
Joe Schlesinger, you have someone with a question for Lucien Bouchard.
Edward Cardinal from Stony Creek, Ontario, has a question for you, Mr. Bouchard.
Yeah, I'd like to know your plan to cut the deficit.
Yes, we have a plan to cut the deficit. obviously we cannot propose a plan for 5 years because we don't intend to be in the Parliament for 5 years. But we think that we should radically cut the fat of the government, that we should cut $10 billion from the expenses at the first year. It can be done through a 25% cut in the budget of the military budget, through the suppression of duplication for an additional $1 billion, and the rest, the $6 billion, the rest being cut with the suppression of tax shelters, like, for example, the scandalous family trust, and the credit given to corporations' investment abroad, and the elimination of the fat of the government. I asked the old parties yesterday to commit themselves after the election, in the days after the election, to set up a parliamentary commission where the Bloc would be happy to participate, to look closely and cast a hard look at every item of the budget.
Thank you.
To cut everything we have to cut.
Thank you, Mr. Bouchard. Peter Kent, you have someone now with a question for Preston Manning.
A question from Linda Langman from Portage La Prairie, Manitoba.
Yes, the high personal cost of post-secondary education is of a great concern to all university students across Canada. And I'm just wondering if your party has a plan or a commitment to offering an alternative to the already inadequate student loan plan that's in place. Is there a better way of getting people to university?
Okay, thank you for asking that. We have 5 children, 3 of whom are right in those years, so I have a vested interest in this question as well. What we propose is an overhaul to the student loan program that would put more money at the front end. This federal support for higher education is, again, one of our top priorities. What we then propose, and this is not something new, the Reform Party has been done in other countries, is then to collect student loans through the tax system after the student graduates and gets a job at a flat rate. Now, this system, we believe, will solve the biggest problem with the current system, which is the difficulty in collection. It would give more money at the front end, but make the collection more secure.
Leslie Jones, I understand you have someone with a question for Audrey McLaughlin.
Yes, with me is Ernest Dick from Winnipeg, Manitoba.
Yes, Ms. McLaughlin. In 1991, the Canadian private citizens donated $450 million through non-government organizations for international development, which is about 13.6% of total international development assistance given by Canadians through the government and through others. Given that Canadians have demonstrated their concern for the welfare of people in low-income countries, and that individuals and groups representing such private citizens have requested the Canadian government to at least maintain the current level of official development assistance. If elected, what assurance will your party give us that non-trade related overseas development assistance will not be decreased, but will in fact at least be maintained at the current level of percentage of GNP?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I totally agree that the work done by non-governmental organizations, of which I've done some myself in international affairs, is very important and, in fact, is often more effective than some of the governmental and directly trade-tied, as you say, aid. So, first of all, we have a commitment, obviously, to remain at the same levels, but we have a target of 0.7% of the gross national product. There are those, I suppose, around the area of immigration and perhaps international development aid. There's a lot of controversy. But I believe fundamentally, having myself lived in Africa, having worked internationally, that we cannot be isolated in this country, that the security of other countries affects the security of our own country, whether that's food security, whether that's security in helping people to develop and to become self-sufficient and to become partners with us. We cannot turn our back on the rest of the world.
Thank you. And now, Joe Schlesinger, and I want to remind members of the audience, please, to keep your questions brief. Joe, you have someone with a question?
Someone here wants to ask a question of Ms. Campbell, and it's one of your fellow resident of Vancouver, from your own riding, even from Kitsilano. And her name is Linda Paltz.
Single-parent families consistently bring in the lowest household incomes in this country, particularly those headed by a woman. And they work daily to rise above poverty. Will you stop taxing single parents on the child support payments they receive so we can begin to get enough money to our children?
Well, I've been looking at a lot of tax measures that could go to address that particular issue. It's a little more complex in the sense that one of the ways of trying to get maximum support for children of divorce is the tax benefit that's given to the donor. But I'm looking at that issue, and I'm feeling very positively about making the change that you request. I think it's also important that we reform our whole income security system and all of our programs to touch on the particular needs of single-parent families. It's why I've proposed changing all of our rules with respect to how we administer aid to education, because many of the rules, in fact, work against the ability of single parents to go back to school and have their education. It's also, I might add, a very important reason why there need to be more women in the House of Commons and in Parliament, because the situation that you describe has come forward, I think, more because of the participation of women in politics, a sensitivity to their particular issues. So the short answer to your question is, yes, I'm very favorably disposed to
and that is the only part of the answer we'll be able to hear, I'm afraid. Peter Kent, you have someone with a question.
A question for Mr. Bouchard from a fellow Quebecer from Montreal, Luigi Laracuta.
Good evening. I'd like to say good evening to all the members of the panel. My question concerns the immigration issue. I'm proud to be Italian-Canadian. My parents were born in Italy. However, immigrants entering Quebec, okay, I have a problem with this, is that they are restricted to go to French schools. That means educated in French. What happened to the bilingual Canada? Why are they not? Why don't they have the choice to speak French or English, or being educated in French or English? That's what I'd like to know. Why is it only restricted in French and French education?
Well, as you must know, since you live in Montreal, this has to do with the fact that Quebec is mainly a French society, and that Quebecers think that the common culture must be francophone, and that the main trunk to meet and live in Quebec has to be in French. That's why when immigrants come to Quebec, they must integrate in French. Of course, they have the right, and Quebec encourages them to keep their culture and their own language. But the collective life in Quebec must be French. That's a natural law, natural right of Quebecers. If you don't do that, of course, people will be attracted directly to the English community, and slowly the French community of Montreal mainly will erode. That's a normal thing for society to protect its own language.
Leslie Jones, you have someone with a question.
A question for Mr. Chrétien from Rita Gould, Uxbridge, Ontario.
Thank you. In 1989, the House of Commons signed an all-parties resolution to eliminate child poverty by the year 2000. However, those 4 years, 250,000 more children, now live in poverty. I would like to know what specific things your party will do to help keep that commitment to its children.
You know, the only good social program is getting jobs for people who want to work. So it's why our priority is job. Second, there is a lot of poverty in families where they cannot go to work because we don't have enough daycare places in Canada. So we have a program to create more daycare places so that the person that is home, probably most of the time a woman, she can go to work and the children are in good hands while she is earning money to eliminate the poverty in the family. So it is through job creation and daycare mainly that will achieve to reduce the level of poverty among the young people in Canada.
Joe Schlesinger.
A question for Ms. Campbell from Dina Siegel from Thornhill, Ontario.
My question is about women's rights. I'd like to ask Ms. Campbell, given that a private member's bill attempting to recriminalize abortion is inevitable, and given that you would allow a free vote where MPs could vote their conscience, would you personally vote against any bill putting abortion back into the criminal code?
Yes.
Peter Kent?
Yes, a question for Ms. Campbell from Mary Kirichuk from Mississauga, Ontario.
Your budget for the campaign leadership was $1.8 million. But the Globe and Mail reported today that you actually spent over $4 million. Can you explain to me why this occurred, and is this indicative of your future government spending habits?
No, it's not. And first of all, that isn't an accurate sum of money. My leadership campaign will pay its way.
Leslie Jones.
And we have another question for Ms. Campbell from Guy Cormier from Montreal.
Yes, hi. My question has not been addressed tonight yet. I would like to know regarding the gays and lesbian issues. I would like to know, Madame Campbell, if you are ready to take actions to eliminate discrimination in any laws, rules, regulation, official or not, so that we can stop this discrimination against gays and lesbians in our society.
Well, as Justice Minister, I introduced amendments to the Canadian Human Rights Act that would make sexual orientation a prohibited ground of discrimination. It would be my intention to ensure that those amendments pass on becoming government. However, that is already the law, because in not appealing the Hague decision that came from the Ontario Court of Appeal, the federal government accepted that that protection was there under the Canadian Human Rights Act.
Joe Schlesinger.
A question for Mr. Chrétien from Bob Flottorp from Regina.
Yes, Mr. Chrétien, I was wondering where on your priority list does the agricultural farmer lie?
It's a very high priority, and I'm happy that you're asking this question because, we need an agricultural policy in Canada. We have two problems with it. We have the question of Article 11 of the GAD that is very important for the marketing boards, and we support that all the way. I think that we have to help the Western farmers, mainly the grain producer, in this very difficult period at this time because of the war going between the Americans and the common market about subsidizing and gaining to steal away market from us. So we have to compete because we cannot let agriculture to disappear. When we have millions and hundreds of millions of people starving around the world, we cannot produce food that can be very useful in the world. In Canada, we've been known as a good producer, an effective producer in agriculture, and we have to maintain an healthy agricultural community in our society.
Peter Ken?
Yes, a question for Kim Campbell from Felix Wojtowicz from Granton, Ontario.
Yes, Prime Minister Campbell, I would like to ask you this question. From your party, I've been hearing that exports have been on the rise quite substantially and more than ever since the introduction of free trade. How come this hasn't shown in a reduction in the unemployment rate? I'd like to know what it is we are exporting, because it's not showing up in the human resources area.
Well, in fact, if we didn't have that increase in exports, we'd probably have a more difficult period of unemployment in Canada. We're going through a very serious economic restructuring. But since the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, our exports have been up, I think, about $38.7 billion. And in fact, we now have a $21 billion trade surplus with the United States. So the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement has, in fact, contributed very significantly to the well-being of this country and contributed significantly to employment, since every $1 billion of exports contributes about 15,000 jobs to the Canadian economy.
Leslie Jones?
We now have a question for all the leaders from Drew Sanderson of Victoria.
If we could only, though, please, the guidelines were that the questions get addressed to one and only one leader.
And who would you like to address your question to?
This would be for Mr. Manning. Excuse me. Good evening. I haven't heard anything tonight on environmental issues such as protectionism, from everything from forest to habitat of wildlife. Be it on Vancouver Island from where I'm from, where it's a hot issue right now, to even in central Canada where there's areas that would need to be protected as much as anywhere else. Do you have anything in place right now?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that. When I go around to particularly talk to younger people at high schools and universities and ask what kind of a country do you want to live in, trying to develop this definition of a new Canada, almost 40 to 50%, the first thing that is mentioned is a Canada with clean air, clean water, an environmentally sustainable definition of the country. Now, as a new party, we've not done a lot of work on that. What we have done is work in the constitutional field. How should the responsibility for environmental regulation be handled between the federal and provincial governments? As you know, there's a great mismatch right now. We advocate one window regulation. We advocate ecosystem-based regulatory systems because rivers and forests, air does not respect federal-provincial boundaries, to which federal and provincial bodies, governments would delegate their regulatory authorities for the environment. So one system environmental regulation, integration of federal provincial powers rather than division of powers.
Thank you. And who was the person, Leslie, the questioner?
Drew Sanderson from Victoria, BC.
Joe Schlesinger?
We now have a question for Ms. McLaughlin from Deborah Nelson from Humboldt, Saskatchewan.
The Young Offenders Act is obsolete and its repercussions are costly to Canadians, both monetarily and in terms of the people's lives it affects. Specifically, how would your party change this legislation?
I think that clearly there is a lot of concern in the Canadian public about the Young Offenders Act. I would, however, quote a judge to whom I recently spoke who said, "No act ever created crime." But there are concerns about it. I'm not sure that I have to say that I agree with all of your assumptions, having worked with an awful lot of young people, but I would say that I think we do have to have a public review of the Young Offenders Act based on the facts of what the results have been. There has not been a really good review since this particular act came into being, and so I believe that a special committee of the House of Commons should review this act with public hearings.
Peter Ken?
Yes, a question for Kim Campbell from Harriet Murphy, Mabu, Nova Scotia.
I'm greatly concerned about the education in our country. Our children are not getting what they should have to prepare them for this generation. And just last week in Halifax, Dalhousie University shut down the only music and art program in Canada and North America for drama, and this because they had no funds. Students were enrolled, program was cut. So can you promise anything that you can do to help our children prepare for the next generation? Thank you.
Well, in my proposal to deal with our deficit, I've particularly worked to try and save those envelopes of government spending that relate to social policy, because they aren't frills, they're not luxuries. They're fundamental investments in our future, in our young people, in our economy. So the first goal, from the perspective of the federal government, is to try and protect those transfers to the provinces. Secondly, to try and make education more accessible for our young people. I've proposed a complete set of amendments to the Canada Student Loans Program, and in fact have brought them in, was able to act on that without legislation to increase the loan limits. Most particularly, I want to work very closely with the provinces in coordinating a greater harmonization and rationalization of our education. I have no interest in taking over their jurisdiction, but we can work with them to share the information that the federal government has on the labor force and on the economy to make sure that we offer the best opportunities for our young people to get training and education in areas where, in fact, there's going to be employment for them.
Leslie Jones.
We have a question for Mr. Bouchard from Sean McAlinden, Etobicoke, Ontario.
Mr. Bouchard, should Quebec separate from Canada, the need to develop an equalization program for the national debt will be a priority. What do you feel is Quebec's fair share of the national debt? Who will be the governing body allocating the division of responsibilities, and what should be their time frame?
Well, the debt, obviously, the debt of Canada would have to be shared between Quebec and the rest of Canada. Quebec would and will never refuse to assume its responsibilities towards that debt because we benefited from it also. The question is, as you said, what part? What would be the exact share of Quebec? We have had a very important parliamentary commission in Quebec 3 years ago called the Belanville-Campeau Commission about the future of Quebec, and extensive works have been made on the assessment of the debt. And they actually arrived at a figure of about 18% after a lot of deductions. It's a very technical thing, but it is not accepted by all people in Canada. Other studies have contradicted the Belanville-Campeau Commission, but I guess that would there be a negotiation, it would be the basis, the bottom line of Quebec.
Joe Schlesinger?
Mark Bellich from Vancouver has a question for Mr. Chrétien.
Mr. Chrétien, a large number of Canadians view the Senate as a prime example of government inefficiency and waste. What do you propose be done with the Senate?
We have proposed to have an elected Senate. We have made it a policy of our party some time ago. We tried to get it through in October last year, about a year ago, but unfortunately it was turned down. We will try again eventually, but I have to tell you that it's going to be very difficult because you will have to reopen the Constitution to achieve it. And in order to do a real elected Senate, you need the consent, apparently, of all the 10 provinces. Some will argue 7, representing 50% of the population will do, but most of the experts talk about unanimity. So it will be extremely difficult to do that. It is the goal of my party to achieve it and to do it as soon as possible. But there is no great desire in the land today to reopen a big constitutional debate. Unfortunately, that will take some time before we can resolve it.
Thank you. And the next question, Peter Kent, who do you have?
Someone from Ontario for Lucien Bouchard, Michael Maskant.
Yes, Mr. Bouchard. How do you intend to gain the support of Canadians outside of Quebec and maintain the support of Quebecers inside of Quebec? In short, how do you intend to gain the trust of Canadians, and why should we support you?
For what? Support me for what?
Why should we support you in the federal government as you intend to run?
Well, obviously I don't call for any vote outside Quebec. It is very much of the essence of the Bloc Québécois' objective to call for Quebec's vote, to build for Quebec a new party exclusively devoted to the interests of Quebec, so as to be freed from the overall Canadian imperatives which are exerted upon Federalist members in the House of Quebec when they are part of the Liberal and the Tory party. So we as of now in Quebec, we don't believe anymore in negotiations, constitutional negotiation. We think that Quebec has to make a decision itself and then to strike the necessary arrangements to organize the two countries. But we don't ask for anything outside Quebec as of now.
Thank you. Now we go to Leslie Jones.
A question for Monsieur Chrétien from Mike Richard, Fort St. James, BC.
Mr. Chrétien, I hear you say that we're the largest exporting country in the world. And I'm sure you know we export a lot of lumber from this country. I'd like to know, assuming that the Liberals form the next government, what would you intend to do about the Memorandum of Understanding on softwood lumber exports?
For us, this is a problem that existed because we didn't have exactly the rules clear on what is a subsidy. The Americans said that the way that we were taxing our producers of wood was not adequate, and they decided to impose on Canadians. It was accepted by the Tory government that we should tax for stumpage fees or the equivalent. And I don't think that it was normal for them to decide how to tax our people. And it's exactly why I say that it was not subsidy, that what we were doing there, and if we use the clause 1906 of the FTA, we still have 2 years and 2 months to negotiate a real definition of what is subsidy, and I'm sure that when the definition will be clear, stumpage fees will not be any more of a problem, and they will not be able anymore to dictate fiscal policies to the Canadian people.
Thank you. Joe Schlesinger.
A question for Mr. Manning from Jennifer Cito from Scarborough, Ontario.
Mr. Manning, you have proposed limiting transfer payments to provinces. Can you reassure Canadians that any funding shortfalls in provincial budgets will not be passed on to Canadians directly in the form of higher taxes or Medicare user fees?
Okay, well, thank you for your question, because it does give me a chance to explain our program. We are not proposing deep cuts in transfers to provinces, because as several people have pointed out here, if the federal government does that, all it does is offload their deficit program onto the provinces. We've endeavored to maintain the federal transfers to support health care, higher education at current levels. We take a little bit out of transfers to provinces, but not a great deal. Our big reductions in transfers are in transfers to individuals, not to provinces. And we do argue that that has to be done, because there's no way you're going to balance the federal budget unless you make some reform of transfers, because they constitute about 60% of its budget.
Peter Kent.
A question to Audrey McLaughlin from Conrad de Barros from Scarborough, Ontario.
Good evening, Madame McLaughlin. Good evening. You've stated that if you're voted Prime Minister of Canada, that you would focus on retraining of workers so that they may fit back into the job market today. Seeing that our unemployed includes both low-skilled workers and highly skilled workers, as well we have our universities, colleges producing graduates, where do you see these newly skilled workers fitting into the job market?
Well, you're quite right that we talk about the need for retraining, but you're also quite right that we have to have a real job creation program. And that's for, as you were saying, I talk to a lot of people from universities who can't get a job. They've got that training. And that's why we need to have not cutbacks to research and development, but we have to encourage more research and development to create those new jobs of the future, to have the jobs available for those who have the training. However, I have to say that we still in this country have a literacy rate, an illiteracy rate, 1 in 5 Canadians. I mean, there is a lot that we have to do in this country with basic upgrading skills as well, so that people can go on to take further training. But without a real job plan that addresses the jobs of the future, investment in such technologies and environmental technologies, a new field that's going to be, I think, a very good field for Canada, we won't have the jobs presently and we won't have the jobs for the future.
Leslie Jones.
A question for Mr. Manning from Anil Khan, Kingston, Ontario.
My concern is my father lost his job during the last Liberal budget of Marc Lalonde. And both my mother and father are paying higher taxes thanks to the Tories in the federal government and the NDP in Ontario. And all the glossy speeches I've heard tonight just do nothing to reassure anything regarding the employment front. So my question is to Mr. Manning. Is there something in your economic plan that can answer the basic question of whether my parents and other ordinary Canadians have to worry about their job or worry about their taxes going up?
Well, yes, our program addresses that. As I said at the very beginning, we argue that at the root of this unemployment is this overspending by the governments and the high taxation levels that go along with that. If you could get this deficit under control and relatively quickly, for one thing, it makes some prospect of tax relief possible down the road. Many of us have never even ever seen a government spend less next year than it does this year. The other thing it does, if the deficit reduction program is certain and sure enough that the private sector believes it's going to happen, we believe that'll have a stimulative effect on job creation. So we believe deficit reduction does address both of those, and it addresses them at the root, not at the symptoms.
Joe Schlesinger.
A question for Ms. Campbell from Charles Taggart from Charlottetown.
Craig Taggart. Ms. Campbell, what I'm wondering is why should we believe that a government headed by you will reduce its deficit so quickly when members of your cabinet, for the most part, will be the same as they have been in the past? And if it's so easy to be done, why is it that a previous Conservative government hasn't done it already?
Well, I've set out a realistic plan to get there in 5 years. It's a plan that involves cutting back the cost of government, not raising taxes. I've already set the process in place for cutting the cost of government by a major downsizing of the government. I've proposed where we can cut government programs. And I've proposed to work with the provinces to create a national debt strategy to try and solve the problem of not simply offloading onto the provinces, but also to find $1.1 billion in duplication and overlap in savings there. It is a realistic plan, and I am deeply committed to it because I believe it is essential in order to preserve the things that matter to us as Canadians, in order to preserve our social programs. My entire party is committed to seeing this plan through. It is realistic, and I believe it is the only plan that offers Canadians the hope not only of eliminating the deficit, but also of preserving jobs and social programs.
Peter Kent.
A question for Jean Chrétien from Derek Armstrong of West Bank, British Columbia.
When the tariffs in the U.S. are dismantled, are we going to be sacrificing more of our natural resources just to create a temporary job base or temporary jobs for people just so it looks good on paper, or what's going to happen here in the next couple of years?
Would you repeat the beginning of your question?
When the tariffs are taken down in the United States, like a large part of our trade with the United States is our natural resources. And when the trade barriers go down, with this act, you're saying that we're going to talk to them for the 2 years that we have left to remain to talk to them about it. Are we going to be dumping a lot of our natural resources, sacrificing our natural resources just to create jobs temporary jobs?
No, because, natural resources has been part of the wealth of Canada. We have exported natural resources all our life. Either it's agriculture, it's natural resources, or forestry, it's natural resources. So we have plenty of resources and we have to export. What we have to do is to make sure that we have access to the market. And that when we go in the American markets, what they've done with the controversy that they had some years ago, they decided to stop buying from Canada, pretending that our tax system was not adequate in relation to the stumpage fees. What we want is to have regular access so that we can sell regularly and manage our resources to make sure that the renewal of our resources will be managed in a proper fashion.
Thank you. Leslie Jones.
A question for Ms. Campbell from Adele Heffer of Petty-Kodiak, New Brunswick.
Before I say anything, I'd like to ask all of you to look in your crystal balls up there and tell me if the Blue Jays are going to win the World Series.
Sure, very likely.
We hope so.
And Ms. Campbell, I would like to ask you, if you form the next government, can we expect you to cut government spending to the bone? Many of us Canadians are eating macaroni and cheese, and it would be nice to see some of you people in government cutting yourselves back to the point where your luxury items are also gone. And please remember that we are all Canadians and we all pay taxes.
Well, you've said it very, very well, and I'm very deeply committed to doing that. In fact, I started doing that already when I cut back the size of government the first day that I was Prime Minister of Canada. I've also proposed that all of the perks and services that we have on Parliament Hill be put on either a self-financing basis or be wound up, be abolished. I believe it's extremely important that we set our own fiscal house in order. That's why I've launched a major initiative on government waste and inefficiency, and it's all here in our plan. I believe the only way that government can be credible to Canadians is when we start at the top. And there was a very interesting comment by another one of your fellow citizens in the Toronto Star the other day, which said, they always start at the bottom, they never start at the top. I want to preserve services to Canadians. I want to make the savings at the top, in the fat and the cut of government, and it's set out very clearly here exactly how I have done it and how I propose to continue doing it.
And now I'm afraid, Joe Schlesinger, the way the time is looking, you now have our last question from the President.
A short question, I take it, and a short answer for Ms. McLaughlin from Glendale Epishak from Winnipeg.
Hi. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on implementing tax changes for couples who decide to stay home to take care of their children.
As you know, we have a very strong child care program, which I think is very important to double the child care spaces in Canada. But as a mother myself who stayed home and was happy to stay home with my children and privileged to stay home because not everyone has that choice, I think we really do have to value the work of women and to say, yes, we need to look at that and to see that that is reflected in the way in our tax structure. So I think it's very important to look at that. For far too long, the work of women has been undervalued.
Thank you very much, and thank you, all of you. I'm sorry if we didn't get to some of you, but I hope that many of your concerns, certainly you've heard views expressed here tonight. I would now like to turn, though, to the closing remarks. Once again, there has been a draw, and Jean Chrétien, leader of the Liberal Party, if you could begin.
Jobs and economic growth must be the priority of the next government. I have always been guided by the basic values of honesty, integrity, compassion, and tolerance. These are the values that will inspire the Liberal government. Together, we have built a great country. Now, more than ever, we need a truly national government to restore confidence and hope. We have a realistic plan. We have an outstanding team. We can make the difference. On October 25th, you will be voting not only for a political party, a leader, and a team. You will be voting for values, for jobs, and for your futures. Let's get Canadians back to work. That's why I'm asking for your support.
Lucien Bouchard.
For 30 years now, English Canada has been asking, what does Quebec want? Well, Quebecers want to live in a peaceful, democratic, and caring society. They want to prosper and create opportunities for their children. They want to assume the normal responsibilities of a modern nation. Canadians take pride, and rightly so, in their political sovereignty, just like almost every other Western nation. Quebecers want the same, no less, no more. That's what the Bloc is all about. When a system has broken down, bold new departures are in order. The Bloc Québécois will play by the rules of Parliament, but won't be shy in advancing Quebec's interest or in promoting the only durable solution to our crisis, a new arrangement based upon sovereignty for both Quebec and English Canada. Thank you.
Thank you. Kim Campbell.
Thank you. Tonight you've seen the choices before you on October 25th. If you're concerned about jobs, two people on this stage offer a plan. The Liberals will spend $6 billion to make work projects. I have set out a realistic plan to create lasting jobs. If you're concerned about the deficit, there are also only two people on this stage who offer a plan. Reform will attack the deficit on the backs of the poor, the sick, the elderly, and provincial taxpayers. Our plan will eliminate the deficit without raising taxes or compromising our social programs. If you're concerned about both the deficit and jobs, there is only one party which has a plan to deal with both. Reform has no plan for job creation, and the Liberals plan for the deficit to spend more than they take in forever. Our challenge is to create jobs by not forgetting the deficit and to eliminate the deficit by not forgetting people. I have the passion and commitment to meet this challenge, but to do this, I need you. Thank you.
Thank you, and now we'll hear from Audrey McLaughlin.
Thank you. Tonight you've heard very different visions of Canada. Ms. Campbell wants to continue the policies of Brian Mulroney. Mr. Manning would slash and cut so that 300,000 more Canadians lose their job, and in the meantime we also lose Medicare. Mr. Chrétien talks with promise about the future, but every commitment has an escape hatch. And Mr. Bouchard wants to spend your tax dollar sending members of Parliament to Ottawa to destroy Canada. Middle-class families are buried by taxes. Farm families are losing their livelihood. Children are growing up in poverty. We see more homeless and more unemployed. The hurt and the homelessness are everywhere. We can do better in Canada. Appeal to the best in Canadians. Appeal to those values that inspired programs like Medicare. You have the power to change Canada for the better. I ask you to send New Democrats to Ottawa to stand up for you, to protect Medicare, to fight for jobs and fair taxes. Let's build a better Canada.
Thank you. And finally, Preston Manning.
As this debate draws to an end, the media people will be attempting to decide whether there was a defining moment, the 10-second clip that will say it all. But if there are to be defining moments in this election, we say they should be based on what is real and relevant and true, not just on political posturing. The defining moment in this election should be when you go to that polling booth and ask yourself, do I want to elect politicians who spend most of their time misrepresenting others? Or do I want to elect representatives who will dedicate themselves to attacking the real problems? Let the defining moment in this election be that moment when you go into a polling booth alone, without TV, without radio, without a newspaper, and vote with courage of conviction for what is right for yourself, for your children, and for your country. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, Mr. Manning. And that concludes tonight's debate. Its purpose was really quite straightforward: to give you, the viewers, who are the voters, a chance to find out just a little bit more about the important choice that you have to make on October 25th. Thank you to the leaders, thank you to the audience, and thank you for being with us tonight. Good night.